so excited to be here. And thank you so much because this meeting means a lot and a lot of effort from different countries. And we are doing this because we want to share and we want to conserve hummingbirds. So thank you so much, everybody, to be here. And for our next speaker, so I'm going to present our following speakers. And
okay, great. Thanks, Sarah.
yes, and we have our leadership that is Dr. Greg Butcher, that he has been working very hard with us building this and this association. So thank you, Greg, to be here, and I will let you start the meeting. Thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone. I am Greg Butcher with U.S. Forest Service International Programs, and really excited to be involved with Western Hummingbird Partnership, and glad you could all join us. The whole purpose of this conservation planning is two parts. It's to make sure we're doing the right things for these Western hummingbirds, and to broaden our partnership, to try to get more people involved. This is the group of people we started with. And so Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Point Blue Conservation Science, Canadian Wildlife Service, where are they? Yeah, Environment Climate Change Canada, the University of Guadalajara, Coxur, which is Sarah E., Klamath Bird Observatory, and Environment for the Americas, and that's Sue Bonfield, our esteemed coordinator. So Deanna Williams, Jamie Ratliff are from Forest Service, John Alexander from Klamath Bird Observatory, Sarah E. from University of Guadalajara, Christine Bishop from Canada, Jeff Geibel from Point Blue Conservation Science, and Sue. So welcome everybody, and on to the next. So we've been working together to envision a future with thriving populations of Western hummingbirds. And a longer version of that is our shared passion for hummingbirds. We envision international cooperation to increase public support for thriving hummingbird populations in healthy environments for bird and human communities. So as hummingbirds go, so go the people of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Next. To learn more about what we're up to, visit our website, Western Hummingbird Partnership website. In English and in Spanish. We have all kinds of good information there. So please put aside some time where you can visit and see all our resources on the website. Next. So here's the role after we complete the conservation plan. We need to promote an action plan. We need to facilitate working groups. We need to update the plan regularly. I anticipate that there'll be annual updates of this plan, and communicate with all of you, whatever your role may be in the future of Western hummingbird conservation. We want you to stay in touch with us and promote communication among us all to promote the goals we set up through this planning process. And where funding permits, we will initiate a collaborative conservation projects consistent with the recommendations from the plan. And we already have some money for that and hope to find money for that in the future. Next. So the problem we face is that in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, we know we've lost at least 3 billion birds in the last 50 years, which unfortunately is about the time frame of my participation in all this. So we hope to do better in the future. Next. And that's about 25% of the birds of North America. So it's a really severe loss that's happened over the last 50 years. So if we look at the population trends among North American hummingbirds, this is Simon English, Christine Bishop, Scott Wilson, and Adam Smith have combined to produce this paper. You can see on the far right-hand side that Rufous hummingbird has done the worst. But we've also seen negative population trends from Allen's hummingbird, from broad-tailed hummingbird, and from calliope hummingbird. For a while there, we've had very positive trends for Anna's hummingbird, but those trends aren't as positive as they used to be. Costa's hummingbird has gone from positive to negative. Some of these, both ruby-throated hummingbird and black-chinned hummingbird have gone also from positive to negative over a 50-year time period to a 10-year time period. So things have been bad for several of these species for 50 years and are increasingly bad in the last 10 years. And so it's very timely to do conservation plans for these species and to see what we can do together to improve their prospects. Next. So because of these negative population trends, we have status changes in the 3 North American countries. IUCN and BirdLife provide the global changes on the far right column, and Rufous hummingbird is listed as near threatened. The other species so far are considered least concern. In Canada, they are considering Rufous hummingbird as a species of at risk, which will come under their conservation priorities if it accepts that status. And then you can see that 5 species are listed for the US in the United States as birds of conservation concern by US Forest Service. And these are the vulnerability scores in Mexico with a very high score for Allen's hummingbird, and then pretty high scores for both Calliope and Rufous, and relatively high score for broad-tailed and Costas, with black-chinned and Anna's still relatively low concern in Mexico. But you can see under the US birds of conservation concern, to have 5 of these species all be relatively high concern is again a really good reason for us to be doing this conservation planning and considering what activities we can take as a group to help these species. Next. We have published a status of the Rufous hummingbird, which is available as a download as a PDF on our website. Next. And I think this is all of us. So we are all part of the conservation plan team. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to working with you together to come up with the top priorities for the team. And here's a list of people who've been with us so far. And if you're new to the team, we will add your name as well. So these are the species we're focused on. These are the Western hummingbirds that are shared at least between the United States and Mexico, and several of these also getting up into Canada and becoming trinational priorities. Next. We will go back to Sarah E. to talk to us about the non-breeding ranges of these hummingbirds. Welcome all, and thank you very much.
Gracias, Greg. Bueno, fíjense que precisamente estas 7 especies que nos acaba de mencionar Greg son de casi todas, pues pesan entre 3 y 4 gramos cuando mucho. Y bueno, aquí les presento a Celasfros rufus, que inverna principalmente en el centro occidente de México. Y si ustedes pueden ver en el mapa, cuando llega al invierno, su zona es más reducida que la que tiene cuando está anidando. Una de las cosas que nos llama mucho la atención es que esta especie está ya puesta como una especie tipping, o sea que está dentro del reporte del estado de aves de los Estados Unidos. Quiere decir que ha perdido 2/3 de su población y que en los próximos 50 años puede perder el resto de su población. Es por eso que estamos muy preocupados y generalmente esta especie se establece en México 8 meses y una de las cosas es que, bueno, pareciera que hay una distribución altitudinal entre la proporción de machos, hembras y juveniles. Siguiente, por favor. Otra especie que también está considerada dentro del reporte del estado de las aves de Estados Unidos es este Celasphorus sassi, y esta es otra especie que, si ustedes ven, está muy reducida su distribución en el eje neovolcánico de México. Entonces, también si nosotros estamos sufriendo cambios de tenencia no de tenencia de tierra, sino del uso de la tierra, pues vemos que esta especie está amenazada, igual que Celasphorus rufus. La siguiente, por favor. Bueno, aquí tenemos el Celasphorus calliope, que es otra especie, la más pequeña migratoria de América del Norte, que encontramos su distribución en la Sierra Madre Occidental, en el eje neovolcánico y Sierra Madre del Sur. Generalmente comparte su distribución con Celasphorus rufus, también sassi, y todas estas especies con el broadtail, que es Celasphorus platycercus, los encontramos distribuidos en los bosques de pino, pino encino, en zonas templadas de México. La siguiente. Bueno, aquí está Celasphorus platycercus. Si ustedes ven, a diferencia de los otros mapas, este está de color como, ya no es azul. El color azul significaba que ahí es donde están invernando. Sin embargo, Celasphorus platycercus tiene dos poblaciones, una que es migrante y otra que es residente. Y como ustedes pueden ver, pues sigue el patrón de la Sierra Madre Occidental, Sierra Madre del Sur, eje neovolcánico, y de la Sierra Madre Oriental. Entonces, pues también es una especie que estamos viendo sus poblaciones porque pareciera que está siendo afectado por la temperatura. Siguiente. En relación a Calipteana, es una especie que ha expandido su territorio. Generalmente se encontraba en la parte norte de México, ahí invernaba, pero también la tenemos en el occidente de México. Y bueno, creemos que se cree que esta especie ha expandido su territorio debido al uso de bebederos, o también porque bueno, va migrando hacia zonas más calientes, y la encontramos en los bosques que están en el oeste, templados, pero a la vez tropicales. Siguiente. Calipte coste es otra especie que también está expandiendo su territorio. Y bueno, aquí el mapa nada más muestra que llega hasta Sinaloa cuando inverna, pero generalmente lo estamos encontrando en Jalisco, toda esta parte. Y esta también la encontramos en bosques tropicales caducifolios. Entonces, bueno, estas dos últimas especies vemos que pareciera que sus territorios de invernación los están expandiendo, y muchos dicen que se debe al uso de bebederos, o porque también hay plantas cultivadas exóticas que están beneficiando a esta especie. La siguiente, por favor. Y bueno, por último tenemos a Archilochus alexandri. Archilochus alexandri también es otra especie que la vamos a encontrar, si ustedes se fijan, invernando acá en las costas del oeste de México, y agarra la Sierra Madre Occidental y el eje neovolcánico. Es una especie que la encontramos también en la parte alta de las montañas, o tiene una distribución altitudinal amplia que puede estar de los 0 a los 3,000 metros sobre el nivel del mar. Entonces, en general, todas estas especies sí estamos con esta preocupación, porque si bien las estamos encontrando que su distribución pareciera estar cambiando, pareciera también que su distribución tiene que ver mucho con la diferenciación de edades y sexos. Bueno, sería todo. Bueno, a continuación tengo el gusto de presentarles a la doctora Coro Arismendi, que es profesora investigadora de la UNAM. y bueno, ella nos va a presentar también cómo vemos el efecto de cambio climático en las poblaciones de estos migratorios de larga distancia que acabamos de mencionar. Bienvenida, doctora Coro.
Hola, buenos días. Muchas gracias Susan, muchas gracias Saraí por invitarme a este taller. Y pues no sé si me van a permitir compartir mi pantalla.
Sí, puede
¿Sí puedo?
compartir. Ujú.
Ok. A ver si se puede.
Sí, sí, perfecto.
¿Sí?
Sí.
Ok. Muy bien, gracias. Lo voy a decir en español, espero que esté bien. Este es el trabajo colaborativo que hemos hecho entre David Prieto, Daniela Remolina, Laura Núñez y yo, entre otros, para tratar de ver cuáles son las consecuencias del cambio climático global sobre las interacciones ecológicas. Las consecuencias del cambio climático, pues en general lo que se dice es que las especies pueden desplazarse hacia nuevas áreas de distribución bajo el supuesto de que sean capaces de realizar un seguimiento del nicho. Es decir, que siguiendo las características ambientales que les son propicias, pueden moverse tratando de acoplarse al cambio climático. Esto obviamente depende de su historia natural, hay muchas características que les podría permitir o no hacer esto, como la capacidad de dispersión, la tasa de reproducción, el grado de especialización, etc. Es obviamente un proceso dinámico que puede generar poblaciones fragmentadas, pero que también puede generar extinciones, sobre todo si lo que consideramos es que hay organismos que al seguir su nicho requieren seguir a otras especies y estas especies cambian sus patrones de manera independiente a ellas. Se han hecho varios estudios con respecto al cambio climático y se ha dicho que en general hay disminuciones en la diversidad alfa y en los reemplazos graduales de especies y que este cambio climático puede generar una homogeneización biótica. Entonces, bueno, el problema que nosotros nos planteamos es si la alteración de las interacciones ecológicas, es decir, la polinización que los colibríes hacen con sus plantas y que los guía a lo largo de la migración, entre otros procesos, puede sufrir cambios con el cambio climático y esto tener efectos sobre la funcionalidad y el establecimiento de las comunidades. Entonces, bueno, los objetivos que propusimos es, al final, todo esto es para poder tener pautas para el manejo y conservación de los ecosistemas, pero tenemos que estudiar y tenemos que tomar en cuenta que además del cambio climático que es creciente, tenemos altas tasas de cambio de uso de suelo, como decía Saraí, y pocos estudios sobre los patrones de recambio de especies, es decir, considerando muchas especies y considerando procesos de homogeneización. Existen muchos vacíos de información y bueno, uno obviamente es qué también le va a los países con sus áreas naturales protegidas. Esto obviamente, el cambio climático puede tener efectos sobre todos los niveles de la biodiversidad, que en general lo que se ha estudiado es al nivel taxonómico, algunos estudios a nivel filogenético, pocos a nivel funcional y menos a nivel de las interacciones ecológicas. Es decir, cómo cambia una interacción, los colibríes y sus plantas, que pueden ser muchas especies, pueden ser 20 especies de colibríes, 30 especies de plantas, que están evolucionando de manera independiente y que están enfrentando la crisis del cambio climático de diferentes maneras. Entonces, bueno, los objetivos de estos trabajos, porque ya tenemos en los últimos 2 años 2 artículos publicados al respecto, han sido analizar los efectos del cambio climático sobre los patrones ecológicos y geográficos de la distribución de las especies de colibríes y sus plantas. Hemos estudiado cuáles son los impactos de los patrones espaciotemporales de concurrencia y los valores de representatividad de estos patrones de coocurrencia dentro de las áreas naturales protegidas. Con esto pretendemos identificar áreas que sean prioritarias para la conservación, estén protegidas o no, para poder maximizar la protección de esta interacción a lo largo del tiempo. ¿Por qué los colibríes? Bueno, es un grupo de vertebrados bastante bien conocido, es de interés para la sociedad en México y en Latinoamérica, y es un sistema, la interacción colibrí-planta, que tiene alto grado de especialización, lo cual es muy bueno para estos análisis. Y bueno, esto de estudiar plantas y colibríes que tienen tiempos de vida distintos, historias naturales distintos, pero que están enfrentando un problema de la humanidad que es el cambio climático, es interesante porque cualquier cambio que no sea un cambio de las dos partes puede causar la extinción local. Entonces, bueno, hemos hecho muchas cosas. Empezamos utilizando las 58 especies de colibríes, de las cuales 22.4% son endémicas, y escogimos 450 especies de plantas asociadas. No son todas, pero son las más comunes que se citan como visitadas por colibríes en México. Construimos y depuramos esta base de datos y hicimos los escenarios de cambio climático futuro, considerando los años 2040, 2060 y 2080, usando los modelos de cambio climático de nueva generación del IPCC. Hicimos un modelado de nicho ecológico, proyectamos en el escenario geográfico, ahí están los detalles de los programas que se utilizaron, para saber cómo es que el nicho de las especies de plantas y de colibríes van cambiando a lo largo de los años. Lo que quisimos denotar son patrones espaciotemporales y codistribución en las especies. Evaluamos la proporción de cambios de las especies considerando los grados de distribución, especialización y peligro de extinción. Y estimamos el impacto de la pérdida del hábitat en los patrones de distribución potencial. Analizamos los cambios en la congruencia espacial y altitudinal en los rangos de distribución para las asociaciones colibríes plantas, utilizando estos programas. Y la idea central de todo esto es que sin coexistencia no hay interacción, y si no hay interacción, pues vamos a tener graves problemas de extinción. Hicimos un análisis de priorización de áreas para la conservación, y con el único propósito de decidir cuáles son las áreas que son prioritarias para conservar a la interacción que estamos estudiando. Incluimos también información de uso de suelo y áreas naturales protegidas para ver en qué partes del país tenemos suficiente protección para los colibríes y en qué parte no la tenemos. Este es uno de los primeros resultados. Aquí tenemos el escenario presente y el escenario en el 2040. Y lo que nos sale es que el 89.8% de las especies muestran reducciones en sus áreas de distribución potencial. Esto es muy grave y muy preocupante, como decía Saraí, y esto es para las 58 especies de colibríes de México. Es decir, el 89.8% de estas especies sufrirán reducciones en el 2040. Y una cosa peor todavía, las ANPs, las áreas naturales protegidas en México, solamente cubren 12% de la distribución. Y al cambiar de escenario al 2040, las reducciones serán del 15%. Las reducciones en promedio para el rango de los colibríes, no se los puedo presentar todos aquí, tenemos los artículos publicados que se los puedo mandar con todo gusto. Para el rango de los colibríes es 3.39% en 2040, 29.97% en 2080. Asumiendo que las especies se pueden dispersar a nuevas áreas. Solamente 23% de las especies son ganadoras, es decir, es bien poquito las especies de colibríes que van a ser beneficiadas por estos cambios. Los factores que tienen más problemas sobre los colibríes son la temperatura media anual, la temperatura máxima del mes más cálido y la temperatura media del trimestre más frío, que tienden en todos los escenarios a aumentar más de 2%, de 2 grados centígrados, perdón. Los valores de precipitación anual también tienen un efecto sobre estos patrones. La riqueza de especies de colibríes va a disminuir en más de 37.3% para el 47% de los sitios en México. Esto es muy preocupante, es muy grave. Los colibríes en efecto van a poder moverse y van a poder seguir su nicho, pero la mayoría de los sitios van a tener casi 40% de disminución en cuanto a su diversidad de colibríes. Las áreas que eran hotspots van a disminuir 34.28% en el 2040 y 68.81% en 2080 en sus superficies. Lo que pasará es que las áreas donde va a haber mucha diversidad van a ser cada vez más arriba en la elevación en las montañas. La extinción también la encontramos, sobre todo para esta especie, Parasinanthus forficatus, que es muy posible que en el futuro cercano pueda llegar a la extinción. Tenemos ahora aquí las plantas. También hay un cambio en las plantas, un cambio que tampoco es muy bonito de contar. 63% de las especies de plantas podría experimentar reducciones importantes en su distribución entre ahorita y el 2080. 19.1% en el 2024 y 43.2% en el 2080. Y las áreas naturales protegidas aquí es hasta peor porque nada más cubren el 10% de sus rangos de distribución. Y se cree que estos rangos de distribución pueden experimentar reducciones de casi un 8% en el futuro. La riqueza de especies de plantas va a disminuir en 25% para el 40% de los sitios. Las áreas de alta diversidad van a disminuir sus superficies en un porcentaje mayor al 30% y también van a ocupar zonas de mayor elevación. Los patrones de riqueza de los colibríes y las plantas, de la interacción, es decir, va a haber una reducción en el área de coincidencia espacial colibrí-planta. Cuando usamos modelos con dispersión va a ser 5.92% y cuando no hay dispersión 6.8%. Los cambios en el tamaño de la red y el sobrelapamiento para los años futuros, lo que nos puede decir es que va a haber mayor competencia en las comunidades que se queden y mayor inestabilidad en el cambio climático. ¿Qué hemos observado? Los resultados de uno de los artículos, el Prieto Torres en el 2021, Prieto Torres et al. Tenemos alto grado de vulnerabilidad en los colibríes ante los cambios globales. ¿Se pueden identificar áreas prioritarias? Sí. Áreas que sean resilientes, es decir, que no cambian en los diferentes escenarios existen, pero todas estas áreas tienen muy escasa protección. Tenemos muchos desafíos todavía. Todavía tenemos una parte que hacer que estamos haciendo. Daniela Remolina Figueroa está haciendo su tesis doctoral y parte de este estudio lo va a terminar ella con la tesis doctoral. Yo sé lo que me van a preguntar, las especies migratorias, ¿cómo les va a las migratorias? Y todavía no tenemos terminada esa parte. Empezamos al revés, que a lo mejor como lo hubieran hecho ustedes. Nosotros empezamos por las no migratorias y vamos a terminar con las migratorias. Pero se ve muy factible que las áreas de distribución también que les pase lo mismo que a las de los demás colibríes y que tengan iguales los niveles de vulnerabilidad. Entonces, bueno, es muy importante, nos parece muy importante resaltar que esta forma de hacer los estudios de cambio climático y sus efectos sobre las interacciones ecológicas se debería de replicar, se debería hacer en muchas partes, porque si conservamos a los colibríes, pero no conservamos las plantas de las que se alimentan, los colibríes tarde o temprano se van a extinguir. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, doctora Coro. Súper interesante y impactante la situación, ¿verdad? Muy feo.
Muy feo. ¿Para qué te digo otra cosa?
Ajá. Pues bueno,
vamos a poner los artículos en el chat para que lo puedan ver en detalle, ¿ok?
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Y bueno,
Gracias.
no sé, creo que no tenemos espacio ahorita de preguntas, porque claro que todas esto lo vamos a hacer en las siguientes sesiones, donde nos vamos a dividir en subgrupo, pero le agradecemos inmensamente toda esta aportación tan valiosa. Bueno, a continuación, no tengo, aquí no estoy viendo la presentación, pero ahí la tienes, Susan.
Sí, lo siento, estoy moviendo las diapositivas, pero es Christine Bishop.
Christine Bishop, sí.
Ujú.
Muy buenas tardes, Christine. Quiero presentarles también a nuestra investigadora, que ella viene del Environment and Climate Change Canada y es nuestra investigadora en el Western Hummingbird Partnership. Tengo el gusto de presentarla. Christine, thank you so much to be here. And you have...
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Hi
you,
there. Can you
Christine.
hear me?
And for those of you, let me say one thing, Christine, because we had some questions about translation. So if you're having a challenge finding the translation, you should go to your Zoom toolbar and look for the little globe. It should say interpretation and select the translation. So you should be able to get into that. If you're still having trouble, please put a message in the chat box and we'll try to help you while Christine talks.
I just want to check in with you, Sue. So I don't want to hear the translation while I'm talking. So I just click on mute original audio.
You should be in the English room, so I think you shouldn't hear any translation if you're in the English room speaking English, only the people who are in the Spanish room.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah. Hopefully.
Okay.
Thanks very much for the invitation to talk about one of my favorite topics. That's sort of the strange world of avian toxicology. I like to talk about pesticides because I think it is a really important factor that is underestimated in impacting bird populations and their associated food. And I just wanted to start quickly reaching back to the middle of the last century, where DDT was the first chemical that was introduced that eventually became industrialized in the 1940s. And this was, when we think about pesticides, I think we need to put it in context because it was considered a miracle compound. But the world was naive to the possible effects on wildlife, the potential for resistance of pests to pesticides, the potential impact of the loss of non-target insects as an important part of food webs. And in this case, we're talking about bird food, and the long-term persistence of these pesticides in the environment. And for example, for DDT, the half-life in soil is 43 years. And we know from studies just here in British Columbia that concentrations that we detected in orchard areas 20 years ago are almost exactly the same as they were 20 years ago. And they're very high in places where these compounds were heavily used. So over time, of course, there was this realization that DDT and related compounds could be toxic to the environment. And a number of different related compounds were introduced between the 1940s and the 1970s and early 80s that were designed to still address pests, but be less toxic or less persistent than DDT. And getting into the 1980s, compounds like DDT were phased out throughout most of the world, except for malaria control. And other compounds were introduced, and you may be familiar with some of the names like organophosphates, carbamates, synthetic pyrethroids. The organophosphates and the carbamates were much less persistent, on the order of 6 weeks to a couple of years in soil, but they are much more acutely or immediately toxic to mammals and other vertebrates, whereas DDT had fairly low mammalian toxicity, at least immediate toxicity. So there was a lot of poisonings of birds, but of course also of people around the world utilizing these compounds. So there was, even though they weren't very persistent, there was a large shift in requiring that compounds be introduced that had low immediate or acute toxicity to vertebrates especially, but they ideally not being very persistent either. And this is why compounds such as the neonicotinoids, which I'm going to talk about next, also known as systemic insecticides, were introduced in the early 1990s. If you can go to the next slide. So this is just a cartoon here, but what it represents is all the compounds that were introduced before the neonicotinoids. They were contact insecticides. The idea is that you spray DDT or all the other related compounds, and the ones that are still in use related, they have to actually contact the insect to kill it. They have to come in contact with that insect. So those are called contact insecticides. The neonicotinoids and related compounds that are now being introduced are systemic insecticides. Next slide. So systemic means that they can move all through the plant. They can go in the soil and they can be translocated up into the plant, into all parts of the plant. And they're applied as seed treatments. And those little seeds that you see there that are colored, what that is a sticky dressing that's on the seed. Then when the seed germinates, the compound moves into the plants. And this is actually the most broad scale use of these compounds around the world. But they're also sprayed as foliar sprays. They're used in agricultural, forestry, nursery, greenhouses, and also not listed there for livestock disease and for disease, insects on, such as fleas, on pets. So these compounds, these systemic insecticides, they're highly water soluble, but they're also relatively persistent, like on the order of 1 to 3 years. So they kind of have the benefits of moving into the plant, at least from the point of view of the farmer and controlling insects, but they also stay around long enough that they can do the job for more than one season. And they're also neurotoxic. Next slide. I think you can click on that one as well. So, oops, next, I just have to go backwards once. One more. Like to the previous slide, sorry. So just to reiterate that, a lot of the seed treatment stays in the plant, but the compound also moves into the soil, water, and dust. And as I mentioned, these compounds can be persistent up to 3 years. And in the places where I'm working, which happens to be in berry fields, when you have a perennial plant that's there every year, if you're applying the compound every year to the soil, it can build up. One of the things that do break down these compounds is exposure to UV light. So that's one of the reasons that they eventually do break down the environment. So if you can move to the next slide, you can just click on the animation to move through that. So to put this, just a pictorial representation of what's going on out there, you have these compounds at the top of the slide there, and you can see them. They have benzene rings in them, and that's just a sort of a heads up, because a lot of times compounds that benzene rings are relatively persistent because it's hard to break those rings down. Just give you a sense of the molecular structure and how it plays into the persistence. And the possible route for exposure of birds, many different ways: water, soil, insects, nectar. And hummingbirds, I think, are particularly vulnerable because, of course, they're feeding on nectar, but they're also feeding on insects. And either they're losing the insects through just general insecticide use in terms of their availability, but also these compounds can bioaccumulate in the insects that they might be consuming. So you can click through this here. So these compounds have turned out to be present in almost all parts of the environment where they've been sampled. And this is just an example of what's been detected in a variety of orders of birds. And you could see the circle there for the studies that have shown that they're detected in hummingbirds, in their urine, in their fecal pellets, also even in feather rinses. And sorry, I'll just click on something on the slide there. So yeah, the work that we did early in the 2015, 2016, what we identified was that hummingbirds actually could be exposed to pesticides. And this was the first study that had identified this for nectarophores in the world. And not only for hummingbirds, but I think that this is relevant throughout the world for other birds that, for example, sunbirds in Africa that eat nectar. So it's really relevant in terms of putting this on the radar of risk assessment for governments. And of course, it has great implications for places like Mexico and south of that, where the diversity of hummingbirds is much greater there than here in North America. The other point I wanted to make about that last slide, sorry, was just that the studies that have been done on the white-crowned sparrow, which is the bird there in the upper right-hand corner where it says 78% detection, have shown that these compounds can have significant effects on birds' neurology, especially their ability to migrate or initiate migration. And one of the factors is suggests that it's because they reduce their feeding or their energy levels. And so therefore they stay at their migration stopovers much longer than birds that aren't exposed. So there was an actual study using Motus towers and tag birds on these white-crowned sparrows to show that they did stay longer at stopovers, the ones that actually had been treated with neonicotinoids. So we have some data on other species of birds. The only study that's been published is the next slide that shows that even in a 3-day exposure with hummingbirds, that you can decrease the rate of energy expenditure. In this case, it was captive ruby-throated hummingbirds. This work was done by Simon English and people at University of Toronto. And what they're showing here is that you have a control group on the left, and in the gray, these are the energy levels in the birds in all 3 groups prior to dosing. And then in the red, showing the decline in their energy levels after exposure. And this is as measured by their oxygen consumption. Next slide. The other thing that's come out with this work on the hummingbirds is that there's other compounds that are systemic. It's not just neonicotinoids. They're related compounds. In this case, it's called a butenolide, and it's called flupyridiferone. And this compound is by accumulating at even higher levels than the neonicotinoids in hummingbirds, but also in honeybees. And I just want to point this out that keep in mind that where there might be regulation of neonicotinoids, systemic insecticides are not going away. They will continue to be used and new compounds will be introduced. Next slide. So I wanted to point out this paper that was just published in 2022 and might be some of your colleagues from some of them are from University of Guadalajara. I'm not involved in this study, but actually one of the people that's involved from Canada is actually works at my alma mater, University of Guelph in Ontario, which is in central Canada. And this is just a study that identifies neonicotinoids and other pesticides in honey from honeybee colonies. If you go to the next slide, there's a map there. And this work was mainly done in Jalisco. And so I'm sure you're familiar with some of these locations. Next slide. And of course, you can't read all of the different compounds and locations here, but I wanted to get it on the record and just highlight this for you so that you can find this paper yourself. But you can see here that neonicotinoids, but a lot of other pesticides being detected in honey and honeybees. This isn't unusual. This is the sort of thing that you might see across a lot of other locations around the world. The point being is that the work that we've been doing here in Canada on hummingbirds, but also on honeybees, has been really useful for identifying potential exposure in hummingbirds, because honeybees in many ways are a lot easier to sample. They're distributed across the landscape. You can look at the hives, and honey, of course, is made from the nectar of flowers. The honeybees bring it in, they evaporate the water off with their wings, and eventually it becomes honey. So the numbers and what we're seeing here in terms of honey are a good indication that hummingbirds are potentially exposed in these agricultural areas. I think that's the last slide, maybe one more. Yeah, it's just a summary here of the kind of results that they found in this study, that there was a lot of samples that had detections. They were most frequently found at higher concentrations were the insecticides, and the concentrations were highest near where agriculture is being practiced. And I should say that in our related studies in British Columbia on pesticides, we found the same thing, is that the concentrations are highest in the birds living closest to agriculture, but we also detected some substantial levels of these compounds in sites that are more than 1 kilometer away from agriculture and in suburban gardens. And I think this might be the case in other places around the world, as something to keep in mind when you're considering the potential issue of exposure to pesticides in Mexico. That's the last slide, and I look forward to the rest of the workshop.
Christine, muchísimas gracias, y también pues una amenaza más que preocuparnos, ¿verdad? Y bueno, te agradecemos inmensamente. Al final creo que hay preguntas, están en el chat también. Y bueno, vamos a tener una parte para hacer responder a esas preguntas. Por el tiempo, vamos a brincar a la siguiente presentación con un gran amigo también, que es Arvind Panjabi del Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, y él nos va a presentar los resultados del ACAP, que es la evaluación del estado poblacional de las aves de América del Norte, y que bueno, esta vez lo invitamos con datos específicamente de estas especies focales de colibríes migratorios. Bienvenido, Arvind, y adelante.
Gracias, Ari. Excellent. I'll be giving this presentation in English. So let's see if we could advance to the first slide, please. So today I'm going to be covering some of the information that's in the Avian Conservation Assessment Database related to hummingbirds, in particular population size assessment, threats to the non-breeding.
I think we're getting the translation in on the wrong channel.
Okay, would you like me to pause for a moment?
Sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, I think we're good now. Thanks.
Okay. So the other assessment of threats to the birds during the non-breeding season and wintering area importance for the various regions assessed in the ACAD, as we call it. Next slide, please. Real briefly, for those of you who don't know who the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies are, we are a nonprofit organization with a mission to conserve birds and their habitats through science, education, and land stewardship. We're based in Colorado, but our work extends from the Rocky Mountains and Great Plains south through Mexico and beyond. Next paragraph, please, or next slide. So the Avian Conservation Assessment Database, for for those of you who are not familiar with what it is a tool for coordinating bird conservation actions across spatial scales, across organizations, and across jurisdictional boundaries. It's also the repository for the information used and generated by the Partners in Flight species assessment. And this database has been used to inform Partners in Flight watch lists and various conservation plans. It's also the main driver of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Birds of Conservation Concern list. It's used to identify priority species for funding programs such as the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act and the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, Canadian bird conservation plans, joint ventures, species lists, and many, many other applications. It's maintained here at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, but it's developed with contributions from hundreds of ornithologists. Currently, the database contains information on all birds found from Canada to Panama, so roughly 1,600 species, and it's updated every 1 to 5 years. Next slide, please. So the ACAD contains data on factors related to biological vulnerability and area importance that are used in the assessment process. It's largely a data-driven process with quantitative thresholds discriminating between the various levels of vulnerability or importance. The one exception to that, however, is the assessment of threats, as this is largely an expert opinion-driven score, but it is, there are some very specific definitions and scenarios used to help reviewers arrive at the proper score based on the status. So all the factors are ranked from 1 to 5, following a scale of low vulnerability or importance to high vulnerability importance. Then these scores are combined in various ways to produce regional and continental level assessments. So today I'm just focusing on part of the data contained in the ACAD, specifically population size, threats, non-breeding, and the area importance winter scores. Next. And so we do have this information for 106 species of hummingbirds in North America. Here I'm just presenting the 7 species covered here under the Western Hummingbird Partnership. So here you can see in the third column, the one labeled PSG, this is the population size score, and it is a global level factor. And over to the right, you can see the global population size estimates and where they fall for each of these species. Also, you can see the PSG_S column that shows the source of the information. So you can see all these population size estimates are generated by Partners in Flight through their population estimation method, which relies primarily on breeding bird survey data. So you can see the population sizes there range from about 1.5 million for Allen's hummingbird all the way up to 22 million for Rufus hummingbird. And you can see the corresponding scores there under the PSG. So these scores are assigned, or the thresholds between the scores are assigned to create a roughly normal distribution of population size scores across all the species in North America. So these indicate low to moderate levels of concern based strictly on population size. The next factor over to the right is the threats non-breeding continental score. So this is assigned for the whole population within North America. And you can see that the scores range from 1 to 3, again indicating some species such as Anna's hummingbird actually benefiting from human activities, and other species such as Rufus hummingbird and Calliope, Costas, and Allen's hummingbird having moderate levels of threats on their breeding or on their non-breeding grounds. Over to the right, you can see various reviewer comments that identify some of the specific situations for these birds on their non-breeding grounds. But again, the threat scores indicate, and these, I should point out, threats are looking forward. So we're looking at what we expect to happen to birds and the conditions they need to survive and reproduce, well, in this case, just to survive the non-breeding season, what our outlook is for those future conditions. So for Anna's hummingbird, for example, we expect conditions to continue improving. Broad-tailed hummingbird, the non-breeding threat score is a 2, indicating relatively stable conditions on the non-breeding ground, and the other species having scores of 3, with the exception of black-chinned, also a 2. So again, some only moderate to levels of concern here. Of course, we're always interested in better information if there is more specific information that we can use. And then finally, the last part of the ACAD that I'll present today is a part that we're currently working on. You can move ahead to the next slide. And these are the area importance scores and data for the non-breeding season. And I've sorted them here by species, and I'm only including regions that have at least 1% of the population wintering there. Over on the right here is the map of the assessment regions used. You can see in Canada and the US, these are bird conservation regions, some of which also extend into Mexico. But beyond those regions that cross the border into Mexico, the bird conservation regions are amalgamated to create these super BCRs. Again, it's fairly comparable in size to the BCRs in the north. And then in Central America, the assessment regions are the individual countries. I hope you're able to read the numbers here. It's a little hard on my small screen, but you can see for black-chinned hummingbird, for example, the greatest concentration of population, 40, I think that says 46% almost, is in the south central Pacific lowlands of Mexico. That's that region south of Jalisco along the coast there. It includes the Balsas drainage as well, with a smaller percentage, but still significant in the central Mexican highlands. Also a small but significant population in the northwest Pacific lowlands of Mexico. So I hope you're able to find those locations on the map. For Anna's hummingbird, you see large, primarily, almost 65% of the population in BCR 32, which in Mexico also includes the Baja California region. For Costa's hummingbird, a similar situation with the vast majority of the population in BCR 32. Calliope hummingbird, almost 80% of the population in the central Mexican highlands. For Rufus hummingbird, it's about half the population in the central Mexican highlands. Smaller but still significant portion in BCR 34, the Sierra Madre Occidental, and found in some other regions as well. I know I'm moving through this rather quickly, but I know we have just a little bit of time. Allen's hummingbird, it's interesting here. This is based on eBird data, and what I'm showing you here is actually data that we are still reviewing. So as come to the realization here that apparently Allen's hummingbird does not have any non-breeding data in eBird from the central Mexican highlands region where it winters. So that's something we need to adjust there. And then the last species here, broad-tailed hummingbird, you see has a slightly broader distribution on the wintering grounds, but with the majority concentration again in the central Mexican highlands. So that region is undoubtedly the most important for many of our migratory hummingbirds. Again, these data, the percent of population, are based on most recent eBird analysis, including the STEM models that are produced for many species, but not all, and in the remainder of cases from raw eBird data that has been analyzed. And that's all I have to present on that. Happy to take any questions either now or at the end.
Muchísimas gracias, Arvin. Súper interesante también este análisis y pues ya ahí nos estás dando un lente de dónde están concentradas las mayores poblaciones en el eje neovolcánico de México, ¿verdad? Y parte sur de la Sierra Madre Occidental. Bueno, más al rato vamos a utilizar esta información para continuar con este taller. Muchísimas gracias, Arvin Panjabi. Y bueno, a continuación, por tiempo también tenemos al doctor Oscar Cárdenas Hernández, un excelente amigo. Y bueno, él es profesor de la Universidad de Guadalajara y te dejo aquí, Oscar, para tu presentación. Muchas gracias.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias, Saraí, por la invitación, Susan. Voy a compartir mi pantalla. ¿Ustedes van a pasar la diapositiva? Saraí.
Sí, está preparada.
Sí, ya
Es que
está
hice
listo.
algunos cambios. ¿Puedo pasar la mía rápidamente?
Sí.
Hice algunos cambios. Si gustan, yo la voy pasando.
Ok, momentito.
Gracias. Listo. Muy bien. Bueno, pues les comentaba, muchísimas gracias por esta invitación. Y lo que voy a presentarles rápidamente es un trabajo de tesis de maestría que está siendo desarrollada por Jesús Eduardo López Pérez, quien es mi estudiante, y en el cual colaboran Saraí Contreras Martínez y también Camilo Alcántara Concepción. El título de este trabajo es Análisis de los patrones de cobertura y uso del suelo y su relación con la distribución de Celasphorus rufus en América del Norte. Bueno, por razones de tiempo no me voy a meter en cuestiones de introducción, solamente les quiero compartir que esta tesis consta de 2 capítulos. En el primero analizamos los cambios de cobertura y uso del suelo en América del Norte durante el periodo comprendido entre 2005 y 2015, utilizando información generada por la Comisión para la Cooperación Ambiental, la SEC por sus siglas en inglés. Y con esta información, con los resultados de este capítulo, trabajamos en el segundo, en el cual utilizamos esos datos más otros que les voy a compartir en un momento más para conocer la distribución espacial potencial de Celasphorus rufus y también analizar los vacíos para su conservación en México. Bueno, les comento, es complicado trabajar con análisis de cambio de cobertura y uso del suelo cuando hablamos de varios países por las diferentes maneras en que se consideran las coberturas y los tipos de uso del suelo. Entonces, lo que hicimos primero fue igualar a 13 clases de cobertura y uso del suelo para que fueran comparativas entre todos los países. Y utilizamos la fórmula de la FAO de 1996 para establecer una tasa de cambio en porcentaje en estos años. Los países que analizamos fueron Estados Unidos, Canadá y México. Bueno, en resumidas, hablando en términos generales, lo que observamos nosotros fue que, déjenme cambiar un poquito esto, ok, listo. En total, de 2005 a 2015, se perdieron alrededor del 9% de cobertura boscosa compleja, mientras que aumentaron las coberturas simples en alrededor del 8% y las zonas sin cobertura casi en un 6%. Esto obviamente pues tiene implicaciones para la biodiversidad, especialmente para las aves que dependen de algunos ecosistemas y de paisajes heterogéneos. Entonces, ya con estos resultados, lo que hicimos fue hacer un modelado de la distribución espacial potencial de Celasphorus rufus, utilizando registros de presencia de la especie obtenidas de la base de datos eBird de 2005 hasta el 2020. Utilizamos variables ambientales obtenidas de la base Workley. Y con esos lo que hicimos fue este modelado para predecir dónde estaba ocurriendo la especie de colibrí, utilizando un modelo de distribución espacial de especies. Para esto utilizamos obviamente las plataformas R y RStudio, que combinadas con esta plataforma Wallace, desarrollada por la NASA para el modelado de especies, nos permitió utilizar algoritmo que se llama MaxEnt para poder identificar esos lugares donde potencialmente podría estar distribuida la especie. bueno, nosotros trabajamos con estos registros, ¿sí? Como pueden ver, el número de registros, observaciones van creciendo conforme corre el tiempo. Del 2005 utilizamos 5,444 registros, hasta el 2020 que trabajamos casi con 19,000 registros. Y los pueden ver ustedes distribuidos en los mapas que están acá a la derecha, ¿sí? Esto es importante porque, como les voy a platicar un poquito más adelante, tiene que ver con el desarrollo del modelo. Bueno, para saber cuáles eran los modelos más adecuados, se utiliza un estadístico que se llama área bajo la curva. Y construimos modelos con este paquete, tratando de generar 4 modelos, ¿sí? Con rangos de multiplicadores de regularización para ver cuál era el modelo que se ajustaba más a la distribución real de la especie. Además, utilizamos un modelo digital de elevación que obtuvimos del Global Multi-Solution Terrain Elevation Data de 2010, con una resolución espacial de más o menos 1 kilómetro por píxel. Utilizamos 7 variables bioclimáticas de la base de datos de WorldClim, después de excluir las variables que estaban muy relacionadas, y generamos, utilizamos también los mapas de cambio de cobertura y uso del suelo del 2005, 2010 y 2015. Para conocer el estado de conservación de la especie, utilizamos un análisis de vacíos y omisiones de conservación utilizando el software QGIS, o lo que se conoce como Gap Analysis, ¿sí? Tomando en cuenta lo que serían las áreas naturales protegidas de México, ¿sí? De las que componen el Sistema Nacional de Áreas Naturales Protegidas de nuestro país, también llamado SINAM. Aquí las pueden ver, este es un ejemplo, esa es la parte de la región centro-occidente de México, y aquí a manera de caso podemos ver que tenemos 7 áreas naturales protegidas, distribuidas más o menos en la parte centro-occidente del estado de Jalisco, Nayarit en esta parte de acá, y un pedacito acá en Colima. Bueno, estos fueron los resultados que obtuvimos. En los mapas ustedes pueden ver en color verde oscuro la mayor probabilidad de presencia de la especie, y en colores amarillos los valores mínimos de probabilidad. Como ven, en cada año a la izquierda tenemos Canadá, lo analizamos país por país y después de manera general, pero básicamente se ve un cambio, ¿sí?, en la distribución espacial potencial de la especie conforme pasa el tiempo. Lo mismo ocurre en Estados Unidos, ¿sí? Y en el caso de México también podemos ver algunos cambios más o menos similares. ¿Por qué pensamos que está ocurriendo esto? Tenemos muchas preguntas todavía. Obviamente este es un modelo que nos da escenarios, ¿sí? Pero nos surgen preguntas a partir de estos escenarios. ¿Están siendo realmente los cambios en la cobertura y el uso del suelo los más importantes en la distribución de esta especie? ¿Es el cambio climático? O como lo dijeron en la plática, en una de las pláticas anteriores, hay más bebederos, sobre todo en Norteamérica, en la parte de Estados Unidos y Canadá. Hay plantas exóticas que los estén atrayendo, ¿sí? Y una cosa que observamos es, hay un mayor número de observadores, ¿sí? Como vimos en los mapas donde teníamos los registros de eBird, cada vez hay más gente que está viendo aves, y entonces esos registros tienen un impacto sobre el modelo, ya que utilizamos esos registros para poder establecer el modelado. Entonces pudiera haber algún sesgo que estuviera presentándose, o es todo, ¿no? Una conjunción de todos esos factores. Aquí lo que estamos viendo también es dónde están las áreas donde hay mayor probabilidad de presencia de la especie en color verde oscuro, ¿sí? En color verde claro baja. Y lo que estamos viendo es que básicamente también coincidiendo con uno de los estudios que se presentaron hace un ratito, vemos que el porcentaje de representatividad de la especie que se encuentra en áreas naturales protegidas en realidad es muy baja, ¿sí? Si sumamos estos valores, alrededor del 30% de los lugares donde potencialmente se encuentra la especie están conservados, pero eso no nos asegura que realmente esté ocurriendo eso. Entonces, a manera de conclusiones, pues encontramos que este análisis de las asociaciones entre variables ambientales con la distribución de Celasphorus rufus a una escala subcontinental, pues es un paso fundamental para poder comenzar a implementar planes para la conservación de la especie, y no nada más de esa, sino de otras especies más. Los modelos de distribución de especies son herramientas muy útiles para analizar la distribución de las especies. ¿Por qué? Porque son rápidos. Si tiene uno los datos y un equipo de cómputo adecuado, el análisis es relativamente rápido. Son económicos, el software que utilizamos es gratuito, entonces no gastamos nada en ningún programa. Y la ventaja que tienen también muy importante es que son dinámicos. Si uno, por ejemplo, ve las guías de distribución de las especies, pues esos mapas están fijos en un tiempo, pero estos modelos nos permiten a nosotros estar creando escenarios hasta anualmente o mensualmente, por esa facilidad que se tiene de poder contar con los datos disponibles en línea, gratuitos, y poder estar estableciendo estos cambios de manera semestral, anual o más. Y además, eso nos permite también, cuando queremos nosotros trabajar con instituciones que se dedican a la conservación, como por ejemplo la Comisión Nacional para las Áreas Naturales Protegidas, podemos nosotros mostrar diferentes escenarios para que ellos ajusten las políticas relacionadas con la conservación de las especies. Sin embargo, sí es necesario contar con registros que sean, estén separados, que sean espacialmente diferenciados, para tratar de reducir el sesgo en el modelado. Y pues obviamente encontramos que hay vacíos y omisiones de conservación importantes para el Celasphorus rufus aquí en el occidente de México. Sería todo lo que yo quiero platicarles. Muchísimas gracias. Ahí están los correos electrónicos de Eduardo López y de su servidor Oscar Cárdenas. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. Gracias por esta presentación también muy interesante. Y bueno, ya casi llegamos al final de esta importante parte donde se están presentando los conocimientos que se tienen hasta ahorita de las especies migratorias de los colibríes. A continuación, yo solamente, porque ya se nos acabó el tiempo, voy a presentar 2 diapositivas y estas 2 diapositivas tienen que ver con un tema que me gusta mucho, que son los incendios forestales. Y bueno, dentro de lo que es el occidente de México y viendo las amenazas por calentamiento global y el efecto de los incendios forestales que están en aumento y que cada vez los tenemos más intensos, nosotros hemos seguido ya una línea de tiempo de más de 30 años. Lo hemos puesto también esa línea de tiempo en diferentes estados sucesionales, en los bosques templados del occidente de México, donde encontramos a la mayoría de estas especies de colibríes que pasan el invierno aquí. Y una de las cosas que tenemos es que el incendio tiene 2 caras, o sea, una cara que puede ser destructiva y una cara que no es destructiva, sino que es parte de el historial de perturbación de los bosques templados del occidente de México. Y estoy hablando del occidente, que también incluye el eje neovolcánico, estas partes donde Arvin precisamente nos decía que tenemos la mayor concentración de poblaciones de casi todas estas especies. Cuando nosotros vemos y respetamos el historial de perturbación del incendio, la frecuencia, la severidad y lo que consume, podemos tener un beneficio para poder albergar a todas estas especies que llegan en invierno y pasan casi 8 meses. ¿Y esto qué es? que a través del tiempo nosotros vimos que, por ejemplo, Selasphorus rufus, Selasphorus calliope, son de aquellos que se benefician mayormente de cuando pasa esta perturbación. ¿Por qué? Porque, por ejemplo, cuando hay un incendio, luego viene un temporal de lluvia, y ese temporal de lluvia ayuda a preparar la tierra para que surjan una gran variedad de salvias, y el boom de las salvias es la floración, precisamente coincide con la época de migración y de la estancia que ellos tienen aquí en nuestras tierras, donde realizan toda la muda, que es un gasto energético muy fuerte de todas estas especies migratorias. Entonces, también tenemos a Selasphorus sassin, y si ustedes ven el efecto que yo pongo a través del tiempo, aquí después de un incendio, estos son las especies que se pueden beneficiar. Y no solamente las migratorias, sino también las residentes. Sin embargo, podemos tener un efecto diferente en otras, ¿verdad? Por ejemplo, vemos que Selasphorus rufus, Selasphorus calliope, cuando hay mucha cobertura vegetal, pues no tiene ese alimento, pero sin embargo está rodeado de bosque y se puede beneficiar teniendo bosque y prados que fueron incendiados y que van a proporcionar una gran cantidad de flores. En el caso de Selasphorus platycercus, él se aleja de esas, aunque haya mucha disponibilidad de plantas, pues puede que él esté buscando otro tipo de plantas que no estén tan relacionadas en áreas tan abiertas. También otra de las cosas que les quiero mostrar aquí es la influencia de temperatura. Estos resultados son de mi tesis doctoral, donde vemos que, por ejemplo, Selasphorus platycercus, pues dentro de todas estas especies sí se puede ver afectado por cambio climático, porque busca precisamente aquellas temperaturas que estén más bajas y no esté tan caliente. En el caso de Rufus, Calliope y Sassin pareciera mostrar como una cierta tolerancia. Sin embargo, en los últimos años hemos visto que esta distribución del género Selasphorus es precisamente como ocupar espacios más arriba que en las montañas, en las partes más frías, y eso sí tiene que ver con la segregación de sexos y edades. Por ejemplo, para esta plática, justo que estaba analizando los datos de iNaturalista y GIF, y vemos que en la mayoría de los casos, en todo México donde se distribuyen, los machos adultos están arriba de los 2,000 metros sobre el nivel del mar. Y los jóvenes y las adultas están abajo de los 2,000 metros sobre el nivel del mar. Entonces, también es un compromiso el de tener un rango altitudinal amplio, porque hay una segregación de estos de sexos y edades que están utilizando el centro de México. Y bueno, yo con esto termino. Dejemos que ocurren los incendios, pero planificados para que no tengamos incendios tan intensos por cambio climático. Muchas gracias. Y bueno, paso la voz ahora con Susan para que nos dé las siguientes indicaciones. Muchas gracias, Susan, por este tiempo.
Y muchas gracias a ti también, Saraí. So for everyone, thank you so much, and thank you for those wonderful presentations. It's good to have the background and the experts speaking about what's going on the non-breeding grounds for Western migratory hummingbirds. We know you've been sitting for quite a while. We encourage you to put any questions in the chat box, and we will make sure that we hold on to them, forward them to the presenter or the presenters that it's appropriate for, and have them get back to you directly. But in the spirit of time here, we're going to give you a break. So what we'd like to do is give you a short break, time enough to run, maybe grab that cup of coffee or whatever you need to do quickly. And we'd like to meet back here at 35 minutes after the hour, when we'll meet with Foundations of Success to begin our work. So thank you so much again, and please use the chat one thing for those of you who are still named Stephanie Laredo, but aren't actually Stephanie Laredo, if you could find your name on the screen and hover your little cursor over that name, you'll see 3 little dots. You can click on those 3 little dots and scroll down to rename, and that'll let you put your actual name on there. We're going to go into breakout rooms, and I want to make sure I have the rooms well divided, so would appreciate that. All right, thank you so much. And if anybody has questions here, just let us know. I can go look for those Stephanie Laredos. I see 1, 2. Are we down to 2 maybe? Umberto, are you still there? Or Tatiana? Oh, Oscar. Oh, Oscar, you can do it.
What happened, Susan?
Esa es Oscar.
And this is Oscar Cárdenas.
Gracias, Oscar. No, tengo una pregunta para ti, porque cuando vamos en los salones, tengo 2 salones donde hablamos solamente en español, pero falta la persona que quiero, que está facilitando. ¿Tú puedes facilitar el salón? Es muy fácil solamente para motivar la charla.
Ajá, sí, claro,
Gracias.
sin problema. Tú me dices, ¿verdad? Tú me vas a incluir en el salón.
¿Mande?
Are you going to get me to that room or?
Sí, cuando regresamos después del descanso, Jacqueline va a dar las instrucciones y después vamos en los salones.
Okay. Good.
Oh, we're down to 1, Stephanie. Oh, hola, Tatiana, no tienes audio. Qué raro. Pero puedes escucharnos. ¿Nos escuchas? ¿Sí? Ok. Ok, está bien. Oscar va a facilitar el salón. Y abrazos a ti. Y Miranda. Y la familia. Okay, Jacqueline, I know it was short, but do you want to take it away?
Sure. Welcome back, everyone. So we are going to get rolling into a little bit more of the interactive part of our workshop. I do want to give a little bit of background on kind of the process that we've been using and some of the products that have been developed in the past. So I will start really quickly with my introduction. My name is Jacqueline Lucas, and I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, California. I work with a nonprofit called Foundations of Success. So we're a small nonprofit who partners with organizations to help them with their conservation planning. And I was lucky enough to help with some of the workshops and the planning that was done back in March and April of 2022. So if you want to jump to the next slide. So we use a process called the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation, also known as the Conservation Standards. And this is really just a helpful guideline for people to think about kind of that cyclical process of conservation. And the Conservation Standards was recently fully translated, the most updated version, into Spanish as well. So I'll share that in the Miro board. So as you can see, you kind of go from this initial assessment phase into the planning phase and then work your way around. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with implementing the projects. And then hopefully what projects are doing are this analyze and adapt piece, or reflecting on that process, right? With that adaptive management piece of looking at what's working, what isn't working, how can we be more strategic and allocate time and resources and other elements more strategically, often on an annual process, if not even more. And then finally, you can see the step 5 there is that share piece, right? Making sure that you're sharing information among one another and making sure that that information is being received. So this session today is actually, we're getting a lot of that share piece even before some of the other pieces of kind of the migratory Hummingbird plan are created. So that's always great. So again, we're kind of in that first or second piece there. We've looked at kind of the scope of this work and the vision. We have the different species that are kind of our target conservation species that we're focused on. And then we've started thinking about what are the biggest threats to these species and how do we look at the current context of what is actually happening in order to develop the best strategies to mitigate those threats. So Sue will go to the next slide. And if you were part of any of the discussions earlier in the year, hopefully this looks familiar to you, but I know we have a lot of people who are just joining kind of this team. And so I will also put a link to the Spanish version in the chat. But I just want to do a quick walkthrough of what's called our situation model. And again, this is just giving us kind of an overview of what is happening now with Western migratory hummingbirds, what's impacting them, what are the impacts on the environment we're seeing. So I'll let you click through. I guess I'll narrate as you click. On to the next slide. Perfect. So as you can see on the right-hand side, these are the species that have been focused on, different species of Western migratory hummingbirds. And we will call out attention to them, as you've seen in the presentations, when there's individual differences between the species, but we're also thinking of this more holistically on what's impacting kind of this group of hummingbirds, right? The Western migratory hummingbirds. So go ahead and we can show these biophysical effects. So often when we're thinking about impacts on hummingbirds, and I heard this come up in the presentations, we also need to be thinking about the impacts on their habitat or their environment, because if we're not addressing those impacts or at least considering them, we aren't able to influence the health of these species in a lot of ways. So you'll see pieces of here like habitat loss and floral resources was discussed, insects, as well as other issues with disease transmission, nesting sites. You can see there's kind of a some of the highlights that are represented on the model. It's not comprehensive. Again, this model is really just meant to highlight kind of the biggest pieces that we're seeing. So then if we move on to some of these more direct threats that are, we often say more human influenced, you can see that we have a cluster of habitat destruction activities. We have habitat degradation activities or current practices that are kind of misaligned with the health of these species. We have threats that are leading to direct loss of individuals. And then at the top here, if you do one more click, we can see those climate change effects, right? Those climate change threats, which will continue to come up, and typically those threats aren't going away anytime soon. So these are a few of those threats that have been highlighted and impacted by climate. In the rest of the model, you can see we call these contributing factors or drivers of the threats. So I won't read through these, but there's also an image in the mural board. But you can see for some examples, like why are we having, the threat of maybe these non-native species, and maybe it has to do with forest management practices, maybe it has to do with planting competitive species for erosion control, right? There's a lot of reasons for why these threats are kind of elevated and having the impact that they're having on these species. Okay, so I just wanted to walk you through, there was a lot of amazing minds that helped put together this situation model. We always think that it's never complete or, like I said, fully comprehensive, but hopefully it's a good visual way to give a snapshot of kind of these big categories of the impacts of the species of hummingbird that we're focused on. So we'll use this situation model. And then today we're obviously talking more about the non-breeding area and how can we really focus on which threats are more amplified in the non-breeding area for each of these species, right? This is kind of a general overview. And now we want to dive into a more niche and focused region. Okay, so that's a little bit of the background. And again, all of these images are available in that mural link that I keep putting in the chat. So please, if you ever want to go into the mural link, you can scroll in and out, which is really fun. And you can zoom all the way in, so you're not trying to read this on a little teeny screen. So just keep that in mind as we're presenting. Sue, did you want to say anything more? I'm not sure if there's a slide, but did you want to say anything more about what you all have focused on in the past from the March and April, and also from that breeding workshop?
Sure. Thanks, Jacqueline. Just for those of you who may be new to the process, thanks for joining us. I think most of you have been on for a couple of sessions. So thanks for returning. We appreciate it. We've been through this process twice now. The first session focused on all ranges, no geographic, no particular focus of our work, just overall, an overall look at threats to migratory hummingbirds. Our second session, as Jacqueline said, focused on the breeding range. So we had a really good discussion about that. And I'm looking forward to this discussion about the non-breeding range. So we really want you to focus on non-breeding and what you consider to be some of the factors that are affecting hummingbirds there based on your experience, your expertise, your work, whatever information you come with, we appreciate that. Greg, do you want to add anything?
No, that sounds great. Look
All
forward
right.
to working with everybody the rest of the day today.
Great. Well, Susan, I would love to jump into talking a little bit about the threats and what we're going to be doing as a group. I'm sure if there are folks on here who still haven't renamed themselves, I think Susan keeps putting it in the chat, but she's assigning breakout groups. We're going to be getting into some of those smaller groups so that you guys can interact with one another. So please just make sure that whatever name you're seeing on your picture is an easy name for her to identify you by, and the right name. Okay. Well, if you don't mind, I'm just going to share my screen briefly here, Sue, and maybe I'll walk through a little bit more. I have a few slides that are a little bit more visual since we have the time to go to talk a little bit more about the threat rating.
Okay, yeah, you have it.
All right. So if you've been part of this process before, we've thought about how do we actually rate these threats, because as much as we would like to, we never have the time and treasure, we like to say, or the resources to address everything, right? And we've had some amazing presentations where some of these threats have been highlighted. So today, again, we want to keep bringing the focus back in our conversations and our questions to one another on the impacts in the non-breeding region and that non-breeding area. So we will go through, all of you have a spot to be doing a threat rating, and I'll pull up the spreadsheet that we're going to be using in just a minute. But when we're thinking about rating some of those direct threats, those are kind of those pink red boxes that you saw. You can think of the impacts of mining or degradation, agriculture, or other pieces that you saw in there. We want to think about kind of three different things. We want to think about the extent, right, or the proportion of the target that's going to be affected. We want to think about the severity, so how much damage to this group of species is the threat going to cause. And then we want to think about irreversibility, so the degree to which the effects of the threat can be reversed, right? And I'll break this down a little bit more. You don't have to memorize this. I will link in the spreadsheet all of these ratings, but we'll do this on a scale of very high to low. Okay, so a 4 being a very high threat, all the way down to a low being, or all the way down to a 1 being a low threat, kind of the lowest you can rate them. They've already been identified as threats to this group of hummingbirds. So now we want to think of how big of a threat is this in the non-breeding region for the hummingbird, right? So maybe some of the threats that were identified prior are only threats, or typically threats in other regions that they migrate through, but not in the non-breeding grounds. So that's why we're doing this second threat rating. Again, I won't go through these, but everything will be from 4, 3, 2, and 1. When we think about climate threats versus conventional threats, because we keep coming back to the impacts of climate change, we just want to think irreversibility becomes something that's difficult to rate with climate, because it would just be rated high across the board, right? How irreversible can we think of a lot of these climate threats? And a lot of them, the threat would just be very high. So think of that feasibility of management and think about the degree to which the effects of a climate threat can be mitigated, right? So we're happy to answer any questions about this, but I just, while we had a few minutes, wanted to just note that when you're thinking about climate, if it's difficult to think about irreversibility, then think about how feasible is the management of this climate threat. Okay. So as we get into groups, we are going to be putting you, sending you the link to this spreadsheet. There are the models that I just showed you in English and in Spanish on the first two tabs here. And then that threat rating criteria, again, scope, severity, and irreversibility, are listed here in English and in Spanish. And then we are going to be working together in this threat rating sheet. So hopefully I have everyone's name up here, but I can be adding names if anyone doesn't see their name in here. It's really easy to add a name. And then what you're going to be doing is going through each of these different threats here, and you're going to be adding your rating of 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so that's going to be kind of our assignment in small groups. The reason we're putting you in small groups, even though you all have a name for yourself, is first off, we want you to actually feel like you can meet other people who are in the workshop today, but also after you're done with your threat rating, hopefully there'll be some time in your small group to discuss maybe some of the similarities and differences on how you rated threats. Again, this is for the non-rating range. Why don't we take a few minutes, and I'll zoom in really far here so hopefully everyone can see, and we'll take maybe 10 minutes or less. And I want us to think about whether or not there is any major threats for the non-breeding area that aren't encompassed in a threat that's listed here already. Okay, so I will put the link in here if you want to be working directly in Miro. I know not everyone is comfortable in Miro, so please feel free to take yourself off mute. Feel free to write in the chat. If you have agreement towards something, feel free to use the thumbs up. I can see people are already practicing, but let's just go through this list. Sue, Greg, any questions or comments before we dive in?
No, I think that looks good, and I really appreciate the description. So I think everybody, unless I'm checking the chat box to see if anybody has questions.
Oh, I see one from Arvind.
Yeah, we have one from Arvind. What do you do if you're not knowledgeable? We can start with that. Jackie?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you feel like you just don't have the expertise, or it's not something that you kind of know the literature on, then you can skip it. It won't make it a 0. It won't lower everyone else's average. It just won't be included. If you skip something, though, that's also a great opportunity when you're in your small groups after everyone's taken some quiet time to do their ratings. Then you can ask that question, and maybe we can all learn a little bit of something. So don't add a 0, just leave it blank if you really feel like you can't assign something. Otherwise, it is a 1 to 4 point scale. It's not that extreme. So if you have a sense of whether it's a higher or lower threat, you can at least put something like that.
And then the other question is, will we have a chance to talk about indirect threats?
Yeah, so those indirect threats are typically what you saw in kind of those orange boxes. So those drivers, we won't necessarily rate them, but we will have time to think about if there are any indirect threats or kind of these orange boxes that aren't being captured. We'll go into that a little bit later, but at any point, please feel free to write in a sticky note or add something to the chat. Okay, so unmute, type in the chat or in Miro. I want to give everyone a lot of options for contributing since this is such a big group. I see domestic cats in here, and I think we have that one covered here. So we'll keep that one there. I see feeders that are not properly maintained. Does someone want to share more about that?
That should be under disease.
So that might be driving that disease aspect.
Yeah.
Perfect. And these are all great contributions, even if we get some duplicates. Any big gaps you're seeing here where you go, ooh, in the non-breeding area, we have this major threat and I don't see it listed. Yeah, Sarah E.
Creo que pensando un poco lo que está pasando en el eje neovolcánico, que aquí ya lo tenemos, la agricultura, expansión de prácticas que no son sostenibles en respecto a la agricultura. Hay algo muy puntual que está pasando en el eje neovolcánico, donde tenemos la mayor concentración de los colibríes migratorios y precisamente que son los cultivos del aguacate. Yo creo que no hablemos de manera general, sino ya como un poco más puntual. ¿Qué está pasando? Los bosques templados están siendo sustituidos por plantaciones, monocultivos del aguacate en grandes extensiones. Y en las partes tropicales, por el agave. Es muy marcado esto, entonces esos dos cultivos se tiene que hacer algo. Tenemos que hacer algo con esos dos cultivos de manera amigable, ¿verdad?
Great, so I'm going to add that kind of as one of those drivers if we make kind of more of a non-breeding area focused situation model, or we want to call out some of the drivers specifically here. In the non-breeding area, that's a great contribution for that agricultural expansion. Perfect. Oh, thanks. I see you have it over here. And I think we're definitely going to see this threat highlighted quite a bit, this agricultural piece. I see a few more people typing into Miro. I see change soil in the agriculture. Great, yeah, and this is even coming from the demand from the US. I also see in the chat that there is a comment about tourism. Does someone want to speak to that?
Yeah, so for number of birds, human disturbance is an issue, whether it's tourists or other kinds of disturbance. So I'm not sure where that goes in these threats. Does anybody see that?
I don't think we've had just direct human threat that wasn't, feeders or some other activity-based threat.
Is the tourism because of the impact on the habitat, or can maybe Sergio, can you speak to the
Yes, can you hear
tourism
me?
piece? Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. I was trying to find my microphone. Yes, I work in some of the highest mountains here in Mexico, in the high volcanoes, specifically in the grasslands. above the tree line. And, you know, as we go up in the mountains, the area gets reduced. So those areas are kind of really small in our country. And there's a lot of people just going up there. And they cause a lot of erosion. And because sometimes you had the trails well marked, but other times people just walks everywhere. And you know, hummingbirds in the summer are feeding there, and sometimes during the winter too. And so people interrupt sometimes their foraging when they walk through the flower fields. And so yeah, they cause several disturbances to the hummingbirds.
Okay, great. Yeah, I know we have urban development, but that is quite a bit different from tourism. And I think we have the, okay.
There's
Any,
just
oh,
in
go
some
ahead.
days there's many people walking over there, and so the hummingbirds, I think even though they can be quite bold, they get disturbed sometimes when they're feeding or other activities.
Is there concern with that tourism? You mentioned erosion, but also of kind of physically like keeping birds away or scaring birds off from places they should be?
Yeah, it looks like it's two different things. It's habitat degradation and it's direct disturbance where the hummingbirds have to use extra energy to avoid that disturbance. So it's really two different things and I don't see either one of them really on our board here.
Right. So we can keep kind of those tourism impacts as one threat, and then kind of elsewhere on the model, we could add the different impacts that they're creating. So anyone think that we shouldn't add kind of tourism to our rating, and we can see where it comes up?
Can we
Yes,
call
I'm not sure tourism is the issue. I think that it's two different issues. It's human disturbance, which could be from all kinds of different people, whether they're tourists or not, and also habitat degradation by excess human use. And again, I don't think tourism is the focal point here. It's the fact that there's just a lot of people out in nature causing those two separate issues: habitat degradation and direct
recreational
disturbance.
impacts rather than tourism, recreational impacts. Because
so
a lot of the most persistent human activity in some of these areas is probably local residents, you know, out for a Sunday stroll or out hunting or foraging or, you know, whatever they're doing, but it's not strictly speaking tourism. I think recreational is the term we need to use.
Okay, great. And Greg, I completely understand what you're saying about those two impacts, but we definitely want to rate like the direct threat of what we're seeing, and then we'll make sure that the impacts are represented. So we don't want to be rating the habitat degradation because we have a lot of these different threats here that are leading to habitat degradation. So we want to write the threat that's leading to the habitat degradation.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for your input. I see some other things in the chat. And I think some of these are drivers. So I see cleaning the fields. So again, something leading to habitat degradation. Monoculture, industrialized agriculture. Perfect. I will make sure to copy these things from the chat and save them. I think a lot of people have also been typing directly into here as well. I see drug trafficking on here. So I'm just trying to pull out if there's anything that's not, again, covered in the list. I think all of the notes about those drivers are especially important, but adding to what we're rating right now, is there anything else we want to add? I see drug trafficking. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I guess the question with duck trafficking is, are those people using hummingbird habitat in a way that's detrimental to hummingbirds? And I'm not sure how you would turn that into a threat.
Yeah, sorry, Yi, I don't know if you have a comment on that since you've got a little bit of experience with it.
Sí, definitivamente hay amenazas porque ellos destruyen ilícitamente los bosques aún en las áreas naturales protegidas. Entonces nos hemos encontrado que pues están destruyendo los bosques templados. Y otra de las cosas, y esto es algo que se ha visto más reciente, porque ya los incendios forestales, por ejemplo, antes ellos quemaban, ¿no? Para decir, está quemado el bosque y puedes hacer cambio de uso de tierra. Ahora esto ya se regula, ya tiene una regulación dentro de la ley, que no puedes hacer uso del bosque si está quemado. Pero ahora lo que hemos notado últimamente es que, y no está comprobado porque pues son los narcos, es que en sus tierras están brotando especies que están destruyendo al bosque, como una mosca, una mosquita que empieza a destruir los bosques de pino de arriba hacia abajo, y bueno, los está matando y va avanzando esto aquí en la Sierra de Manantlán, en Michoacán y en otras partes. Entonces, no sabemos la procedencia, es extraña la procedencia de esa plaga, pero tenemos algunas sospechas de que sean también como parte de esta estrategia de ellos. Es triste.
Okay, great. And I saw in the chat in Spanish the kind of use of drinking fountains and the link to disease. So again, I'm going to add that comment into the Miro board because I want to make sure that we capture what's kind of driving those threats. So thanks.
So Stephanie has something in the chat that I don't understand how that would go into this threats, which is people cleaning flowery fields because they're considered weeds. And of course, in the United States, we have all these lawns that people are mowing constantly, and some of them many, many hectares. So I don't know how that would fit into the threats.
Yeah, we can decide if that's, different enough from something we have on here, just because we have kind of, urban development and agricultural expansion are somewhat related, but not the same thing. So again, we want to identify threats, and if it's something that we want to rate and see how it comes out, then that kind of human, we'd have to think of a phrase, right? Like
it's a good when I think of it, I think of clean farming, they used to call it, which was when farmers clean up the fields so that they don't have messy looking weeds or flowers or hedgerows or anything like that.
Yeah, it's like the clearing and the cleaning, right?
Exactly.
So when we say urban development, do we also mean suburban development? Is that kind of the same category or not?
Yeah, typically we'll group them in.
Because I think of it more as what we do with our lawns in the United States and just mowing these huge acreages of lawns, replacing flowers with grass.
Deanna added that it could fall under invasive species, although some of the species could be native also.
Yeah, that could definitely be a driver of the invasive species. I guess we just need to decide if that's something we want to add to our actual rating. Do we want to add, and I see in the comments we have organized crime maybe instead of drug trafficking. So do we want to add something? How much more do we want to add?
Sure.
Knowing that the process we're going to do is go through and rate them. So if something's smaller, it might just come out smaller.
Well, I think we should go on and add it because it's been brought up, and then we can see if it, ranks out as high. We have some other comments. Let me just really go through them. So we do have the illegal drug coming up again, and abrupt changes in temperature. And then Deanna's responding again to what to call this kind of clean farming, whether it should be wildland management or open space management, or is it specifically related to agriculture?
Right. I think definitely in the US, we're talking not about agriculture, which is why we want to pull it out. I'm not sure about that cleaning the weeds out, if that's more of an agricultural piece or if that's more of this kind of yard clearing.
I think it's both. I think you see it happening in parks, for example, where, people want to clear the undergrowth out so it looks clean, even in a park. Sorry, maybe you can speak to that for Mexico.
Sí, también tenemos estos problemas que la gente piensa que el limpiar es dejar solamente el pasto. Entonces, esto pasa también en las zonas suburbanas y quieren tener muy limpio o quitar árboles que son nativos también porque sueltan hojas. Y yo creo que a lo mejor la misma, no sé cómo agrupar todo esto, porque tendría que ver con esta idea de que el ambiente se ve mejor cuando es solamente pasto, o también cuando por tradición matan a los colibríes para tener como los tés o amuletos, que no aparece tampoco aquí exactamente esto, pero a lo mejor es parte de la cultura que tenemos que transformar. Y entonces ahí yo me meto en aprietos porque no sé si tendríamos que abrir prácticas culturales que no estén ayudando a conservar los colibríes, como cuando los hacen polvo o los disecan, que esto ocurre bastante precisamente en el centro de México, Michoacán, y bueno, tampoco lo veo aquí, y pues sus hábitats que los quieren tener limpios cerca de las casas. Es como tener un cambio de cultura. No sé si tendríamos que abrir otro o dejar y tratar de dejar esos que ya tenemos, pero tiene que ver mucho con la cultura también.
Saraí, ¿puedo abonar un poquito a eso?
Yes, please, thanks, Vero. Sí, adelante. Sorry, Jack.
Bueno, un poco abonando a esto que decía Saraí, o sea, y también tiene que ver con las políticas gubernamentales, porque, por ejemplo, simplemente aquí en toda la zona urbana, sea Jalisco, sea Guadalajara o todos los estados de esta parte del centro occidente, pues la política de cómo se hace el manejo de las áreas verdes, y eso viene pues como política gubernamental, es que se poda todo el sotobosque, digamos, todas las herbáceas, y simplemente están dejando, como decía Saraí, pues los árboles que dan la sombra y todo lo demás es pasto, ¿no? Pero no dejan las herbáceas que están proveyendo de alimento a los colibríes. Igual, si tú te vas a ver en las zonas rurales, se darían ustedes cuenta que pues mucho de lo que es el bosque tropical caducifolio, por ejemplo, está siendo desmontado, sea para el caso de la agricultura. Ya se mencionó dos cultivos que son muy agresivos, los aguacates y los agaves, por ejemplo, o el caso de las berries, pero también se está desmontando para poner todo lo que son potreros para ganado, y cuando se pone lo de potreros para ganado, la idea es limpiar, o sea, la gente no quiere ver más que los puros árboles, y todo lo que sea herbáceas y arbustos deben de desaparecer. Entonces están eliminando completamente las fuentes de alimento de muchos colibríes. Gracias, Araí. Gracias a todos.
Gracias, Vero. Jackie.
Great. So I want to make sure we have time in the smaller groups to have these discussions. I saw the use of hummingbirds for kind of the necklaces, the trinkets that are worn, as something put in there, so we can decide if we want to put something in here. I think we'll just see how high it gets rated. At this point, are we missing anything? I think we're coming up with a lot of things that drive these threats, but are there any direct threats that we're missing? And if we're okay with it.
Jacqueline.
Yes.
Jacqueline, I think when and somebody else wanted to say something about the phonological mismatch.
Yeah, I tried to add that to the chat. So if I come over here, so the phonological mismatch we do have represented in our model, but we typically think of these as what are the effects of one of the threats. So climate change is a little bit tricky because it's, you know, human influence, but not a direct human threat. So as you think about the climate change effects, and when we do our rating, again, that 1, 2, 3, 4, include phonological mismatch as one of the effects, something that's being created by climate change. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Okay. So again, we're going to get into smaller groups. I'm going to put the link to this in here. If your name is not in here, I will make sure to add it. Or if someone's not in there, feel free to just click and change their names. I will make sure that everyone should have editing powers on this. And again, what you're going to do is go through each of these threats. So column B is English, C is in Spanish. And then you're going to think of your rating 1 through 4. So is this a low threat? Is this a very high threat? When you put it in here, as everyone puts their numbers in here, we'll be able to see an average. I'll say it again. We want to make sure that we're thinking about the impacts of these threats in the non-breeding area. Okay, so even if you know it's a threat way up in Alaska or way up in some other area, wherever they are, what is the impact of this threat in the non-breeding areas of this group of hummingbirds? Okay.
I think you had just shared that with me, so I just put the link into the chat.
Okay, great. I think I entered it at the same time. And I can add these. We'll make sure we get these last few translations in here as well. If for some reason you're having difficulty with your rating, please ask someone from your group or message me directly, and I'm happy to input the ratings in yourself, but we'll be in small groups so that you can help each other. Okay, the first 10 minutes, please try and do the ratings yourself. And then for the following 10 minutes, you can have some discussion as a group. Okay, so 10 minutes to try and work on your own in the small groups, and then 10 minutes if you guys have just questions or comments or want to share any information. All right, we'll be here. If you have questions, we'll be in the main room, at least a few of us, and we can bounce between groups. But at this time, let's go into breakout groups. Please click the link and get into the sheet. I will put it in here again. I will be checking and making sure that everyone has their name in here, and try and be adding you on the go if you can't add yourself.
Yeah, let me add something real quick, Jacqueline. I'm going to move everybody into your breakout rooms. Please know that there is at least one, if not two, representative from the Western Hummingbird Partnership in there with you. So Christine and Vicky, I put you in the same room. I was able to eliminate a room. If you feel like you're in the wrong room, please come out. There is still, well, actually, I think we might have gotten all the Stephanie Laredos out of there. So I'm going to hit the button and you should go into your rooms now. Thank you. One thing it didn't do is ask me how long to put them in there, but I guess it doesn't time it.
I can send out a note.
I think I can do that broadcast. I see how that works if we want to send a broadcast about when you're ready to bring them back. For those of you who are still in the main room, you should have gotten a join a room message. So if you didn't, let us know.
I will broadcast, so 10 minutes.
Can you broadcast? Do you have access to the rooms?
Yes, I can broadcast.
Oh, good. Okay.
I don't know if it broadcasted that already. I was in the middle of typing.
Edmundo, I put you in a breakout room just to help, if that's possible. I don't know if they'll need it though. Or maybe I didn't.
Anyone else in here having difficulties getting to their room? Looks like almost everyone has made it.
Yeah, Shannon is, I didn't have anybody waiting to be assigned.
Okay.
But people were coming and going, so I kept having to reassign. Raul, are you assigned? Are you there? Shannon, are you there? You can put a message in the chat if you're having a hard time getting in, or you can unmute yourself. Okay.
And I don't know if you want to pause the recording, Sue, that's up to you.
If I want to what?
Pause the recording or not.
Oh, yeah, let's do.
I see one more person in here. Yasmin, let us know if
Yasmin, yeah, he's coming in and out. Yasmin, do you have a, you were in room 7. I don't see a message from him.
Did you want to pause that? Sorry.
Oh, yeah, I said, yeah. Yeah, please pause.
Okay. So if you'd like translation, please click that globe. Again, whether you're an English or Spanish speaker, please click the translation you want so that people can participate freely and you can hear both sides of the conversation. I'm just going to share my screen briefly, and I will keep the we'll have a quick discussion about maybe some of the threats that were coming out higher within your group. We'll just spend about 10 minutes. So any interesting pieces that you talked about with your group, and then we'll do some more breakout group work here shortly. All right. So I just wanted to share, if you're still in the spreadsheet, you might see that all of a sudden a few new columns appeared. And I just wanted to bring up the other ratings from the overall average. So when we were looking at the situation of hummingbirds, just kind of pretty holistically, what are the biggest threats across all of the ranges? How are they impacting this set of hummingbird species from earlier in the year? And then a little bit more recently, I think back in May, there was a focus again on the breeding range, and then today on the non-breeding range. So we can see some similarities, right? We have very high agricultural expansion and unsustainable practices, very high threat ratings for that. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone here. We talked a lot about that before we went into groups. Still a bit more mixed, maybe across the mining resources. So maybe a little bit of a bigger threat than overall, just in the breeding and non-breeding ranges. It looks like fairly high, fairly high threats for the urban development, invasive species, maybe a little bit lower in the non-breeding range than the breeding range for fire. So that's a good thing to note. And oppositely, it looks like quite a bit higher for the overgrazing. So it's just nice to look across these use of pesticides and herbicides, fairly comparable, maybe a little bit higher in the breeding ranges. And we also added in some of these threats here. Ooh, this one I don't have an average. I'll add an average, and it looks like maybe not everyone got to that, but I think I can. There we go. So a little bit lower on some of these added threats that we've identified, but I think still noteworthy, and maybe a little bit higher of a threat, which I'm glad we added it then with that organized crime. We are going to keep this open, so we just want to use this as a launching point. And what I mentioned to Sue is that we're not necessarily looking at this to just say, okay, here's the top 3 threats. These are the only things we're going to focus on, but more use it to start a discussion and also see what can be more manageable. Any comments, questions, anyone want to share from their group? I can leave this open or get us back to our faces, whatever we'd prefer.
I do have a question.
Yeah, Arvind.
So we were discussing in our group about, well, first the distinction between overgrazing and agricultural expansion for cattle grazing in mid to high elevations, especially. And I guess I'm just curious to know, related to overgrazing, how that specifically affects the habitat within those areas cleared for pastures, and is there some tipping point there where the cattle grazing itself is not detrimental, but then at some point with overgrazing it becomes detrimental, or are these somehow linked, the threat of cattle grazing expansion and overgrazing? I guess I'm not quite clear on, and also thinking how overgrazing could leave some plants that actually might benefit hummingbirds, like thistles. And I don't know if I'm completely off base here, but these are just some of the things that we were batting around and trying to understand really the threat of overgrazing for hummingbirds versus cattle grazing in general.
I think you hit it when you talked about thistles. I think the question is, to what extent can nectar plants that hummingbirds want to forage on coexist with cattle grazing? And how would that vary depending on the intensity of the cattle grazing? There are probably both increasers and decreasers among the nectar flowers. The cattle probably eat some of them and hate others. So it could be a real mixed bag.
That's kind of what we were thinking. So anyway, yeah, I'm surprised that it ranks so high. So it must be important in some way. I'm curious to hear from others.
There's a lot of hands up. Deanna and then Sarah E. And then Oscar, I think you actually had your hand up first. So if it's related to this, please go ahead, actually, Oscar.
Ok, thank you. Sí, voy a hablar en español, es un poco más fácil. Estábamos discutiendo en nuestro grupo que el tema del crimen organizado es un elemento muy importante, sobre todo en lo que es el centro occidente de México, porque es una actividad que está detrás de otras actividades como el crecimiento del cultivo del aguacate, tala ilegal y la minería también ilegal. Entonces, creo que por lo menos acá en México tendríamos que poner, quizá separarlo de las otras actividades que son, digamos, más tradicionales o comunes y hacer un apartado para discutir un poquito más sobre eso y ver pues cómo vamos a trabajar para tratar de reducirlo. Gracias.
Thanks. Deanna, and especially any comments on the overgrazing piece, Deanna, and then Sarah E.
Yeah, mine isn't on the overgrazing. I think it's an excellent question. So if Sarah, he wants to go with overgrazing, mine can certainly wait.
Muchas gracias. Arvin, en relación aquí al centro occidente de México, lo que hemos tenido es que, por ejemplo, la mayoría de la gente suelta las vacas en tiempo de lluvia. Entonces, después de los incendios viene la lluvia y entonces hay muchísimas plántulas de todo. Entonces, cuando hay las vacas se dejan libres como ganado porque les gustan las plantas que se producen en el bosque, ahí se está llevando todo lo que todavía no florece. Entonces, compacta el piso, porque bueno, esto se los digo porque tenemos algunos estudios que han reflejado ya esta situación de mayor compactación. Y entonces el impedimento de que haya herbáceas y arbustivas aún regeneración de árboles en diferentes tipos de bosque. Principalmente en los bosques tropicales se ve este fenómeno que están muy cerca las comunidades o la gente que maneja las vacas, ¿verdad? Entonces es una práctica que a lo mejor a veces no es tan sustentable, y que las vacas se la come y come porque las sueltan y están come y come y haciendo mucho del baño cuando se les podría limitar la comida, ¿verdad? Y tener un mejor manejo en lugar de dejarlas libres y que estén pastando todo el día y noche.
Okay, gracias, Eddie. So we're talking about then grazing like within forests more than within pastures. ¿Sí? ¿Verdad?
We might have missed yeah. Did you get your answer, Arvind?
I think so, yes.
Great.
Thanks.
Deanna?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, we just had a really great question come up in our group that I actually felt kind of silly that I didn't know the answer to, and that is, when we're talking about non-breeding, are we mainly talking about Mexico, or are we also talking about the non-breeding populations of Annas that occur in North America and Allens that are in California? Because that would change the answer of some of the folks in our group. And so I just didn't know how we wanted to address that.
That's a really good question, Deanna. I kind of feel like to keep this focused, we should stick to ranges in Mexico, so we don't start to confuse our discussions. And do you feel like California gets captured along with other threats when we're looking at breeding grounds as well? In California, for example? Greg, do you have a thought? That's my idea.
Yeah, I agree, especially because we're not that worried about Anna's. We definitely want to capture anything we can learn about Alan's, because a lot of people are concerned about that. But I just think it'll confuse things if we do that here today.
Okay.
Christine, and then Arvind.
I'll just add that this was raised by Sherry Williamson as well in our group in the context of Costa's hummingbirds, you know, and they're breeding early in the spring in January to June, at lower elevations, and then moving up to higher elevations. And, you know, that's all outside of Mexico, you know, so this is something that is not, maybe not something we're talking about as a focus today, but it's been brought up in more than one group.
Thanks. Arvind?
Yeah, just quickly, I looked into the issue with Allen's hummingbird, and apparently the eBird stem models shows the species wintering entirely in Southern California. So I don't know if there's a shifting population or if, you know, Mexico is just not represented because there's too few records in the Central Highlands. There are winter records there, but I didn't look at the dates and all that. Anyway, just wanted to point that out, so in case folks were wondering why that turned out that way, but maybe something to address.
Thanks for that. And I promise we're capturing everything that's in the notes and that's being commented here. Why don't we take Adam, and then I do want to make sure that you guys get one more break in here.
I just wanted to just point out the fact that I think that we should be focusing on Mexico here, but also to remember that there are a number of species that winter within a couple hundred miles north of the border in California, Arizona, and New Mexico and Texas, and not just Anna's.
Thanks for that. Sarah, is your hand up from earlier, or do you have a comment?
Sí. En relación a lo que dice Arvin, sí tenemos representantes en México, en el eje neovolcánico y aquí al terminar la Sierra Madre Occidental del Celasphorus sassin. Entonces sí están llegando Celasphorus sassin a estas regiones y más o menos se está utilizando los mismos bosques que Rufus. Entonces será importante ver que Allen pueda tener como una subespecie en California, que por eso es que se esté reproduciendo ahí. Ahí no he entendido muy bien, pero creo que existe como una especie que queda en California durante todo el año, y en México tenemos todavía no sé si es subespecie, pero sí llega al eje neovolcánico y lo tenemos representado.
Thanks for that. Okay, last comment, Christine, and then I want to make sure you guys get a 5-minute break.
Yeah, this just talking about other issues that came up in our group. First of all, Sherry had to leave Williamson, so I'm sort of speaking on her behalf, but she did point out in terms of the categories, the word entrapment, as it was translated into Spanish, it might have been a bit confusing because that word entrapment was supposed to represent in Spanish accidental entrapment, not entrapping for illegal trade. something to think about in terms of changing that, or if that's how people rank them. Secondly, the hunting, which was another category, more of a disturbance issue, as opposed to the actual marketing of these things, the trinkets, and the impact of just cultural perpetuation, that it's okay to, buy and participate in that market. So I just wanted to bring those up. I also wanted to heads up to Ana Santiago, who, because we didn't have translation, she spoke in English, and I just wanted to ask maybe Ana to clarify. She was pointing out that tourism in montane areas can contribute to loss of habitat. This relates to the loss of flowers, especially salvia, not so much a phenological issue, but the tourism impact of clearing of land for them. I don't know, maybe Ana, you can clarify that for us?
Sí, gracias. Yo comentaba en el grupo que hay regiones de montaña donde está habiendo una actividad más intensiva del turismo, y sobre todo en lugares donde hay desarrollos para construir cabañas. Entonces, las personas suelen limpiar sus terrenos y no quieren tener mucho espacio con arbustos y herbáceas propios o sea, como que les falta apreciar las especies nativas, y a razón de eso, bueno, limpian terrenos y buscan introducir plantas exóticas. Entonces, eso es un aspecto que también está impactando en algunas regiones acá en Jalisco.
Thanks for sharing. Hopefully we'll build on that if we don't have enough of that captured. So let's do a quick break, since I know, once again, you guys have been sitting for a while and we're kind of getting into our last hour here. So I want to make sure everyone has the energy they need. So let's try and come back at 6 minutes after. So if you can come back at 6 minutes after, and then we'll dive a little bit more into strategies and actions before we wrap up. Start having a bit more discussion again on those actions, right? Those strategies. And we talk a lot about maybe the bad and what's going on, the threats to these species, but there's also the flip side, right? In moving the conversation towards what are we going to do, to do about it? What are the main strategies that we want to focus on? So again, as we have this conversation, because we've had a broader discussion about strategies, let's make sure that we're targeting this discussion on kind of that non-breeding range. And I'm glad we talked a little bit more about the scope after our last discussion. So thinking of that Mexico and periphery region, where do the actions and the strategies, and what actions and strategies make the most sense to, again, help mitigate these threats and help increase the health of the Western migratory hummingbird species? I am going to share my screen and kind of walk us through some of the strategies that have already been brainstormed, and also just share with you a few places where you can continue to contribute ideas during the discussion today and beyond the end of today's call. So hopefully, I know you've all seen the Miro board, right? And I know the groups have merged. So I have sticky notes here next to the English and the Spanish version. So at any point, if you have comments that you want to, I'll put this back in the chat. If you have comments for contributing factors, again, those drivers or those indirect threats, and you feel they're not represented. Some of them we have captured down here that will continue to integrate, but feel free to use any of these sticky notes. Okay. I also have been putting it in the chat, but at any point, if you have questions that you want us to come back to you with, or general comments, suggestions, or resources, we have a handful of resources that have already been shared. Please feel free to add that to the board. Okay. So back in March and April, again, thinking more generally about hummingbirds and the entire Western migratory region, there were some strategies that were brainstormed, and these came from a lot of different specific activities and have already kind of been bundled up into these more overarching terms. So if you're a little frustrated about the lack of specificity by some of these, just know that we have a lot of those specifics captured elsewhere. We just want to take a few minutes, get familiar with the strategies that have been brainstormed thus far, and then we'll do a similar process where we go into our rating sheet here, and we can think about, on the non-rating range, which of these strategies are most kind of appropriate and most feasible in order to address the threats, right? We have the strategy rating criteria. It's in English and Spanish right here. So as we think about strategies, we want to think about feasibility, the degree that the organization or the partnership could successfully implement the strategy. That also includes the resources and other pieces. And then meaningful impact, right? You want to think, okay, are you able, what's the degree that you're able to actually change the situation, right? We've shown you the situation analysis. How much impact could this strategy actually make? Focusing on the non-breeding area. So let's take a look at the strategies here. And I don't want us to have a completely wide open discussion because I think there's lots of things that could be added. But spend a minute or two and familiarize yourself with the strategies that are here. And let's make sure if we have some questions on what something means, we're all on the same page before we go into the rating. Okay. So public outreach and education, and we also noted in here, because we're moving across so many different geographies, that it would need to be culturally appropriate. Research and monitoring, which can be a strategy on its own. However, you know, as a conservation planner, I'm always encouraging people to not think about research and monitoring in isolation. Support incentives and kind of public policies in order to protect hummingbirds. Partner with and or establish hummingbird supportive practices, improve fire management and post-fire practices, develop best management practices and guidance. So think of this one as, again, kind of that guidance piece, not actually implementing them, but developing. Promoting good agricultural practices, and there's some specifics because I know that's very broad. Chemical use, agroforestry, or the focus on traditional practices. Create quality habitat in urban areas. So again, the focus here is the urban areas. Habitat restoration, collision reduction, and then climate change adaptation, a specific strategy, which again, hopefully any strategies that move forward are considering things like climate change. Okay, I'm going to be silent just for another minute or so and let you guys absorb that before we go into rating. Okay. Sue, Greg, any comments or additional information you want to share about either how we got to this point or how much, oh great, I see some things in the chat as well, or how much this might be used moving forward? I know we'll talk about kind of next steps after.
Yeah, I think this is, well, I think it'll be interesting to see what the group comes up with, you know, with our focus on Mexico. So definitely everybody should know this is coming from discussions based on overall range. And it always depends on who's in the room too, right? So we have a really strong group coming to us from Latin America today. So that's going to be very helpful, I think, to add to this list.
Great.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say we do plan to work in Mexico to promote conservation of hummingbirds. And so this is kind of our best bet to get a group's input on where we should put our priorities. So when we follow up after the workshop.
Great. So feel free, I see some chat in about cartels are illegal expansion of agriculture. And Greg mentioned that might be able to fit under incentives and policies. So again, I know these are kind of bigger buckets, but please put that type of detail in the chat so that if that is kind of a bucket that moves toward, we make sure that we're addressing maybe some of the more the specifics that might be the most influential, especially for this region. Feel free to type directly into these hexagons if you want to add anything, even if it's just a note for the Miro board. Take yourself off mute. We're a little bit smaller of a group now, or type into the chat. Let's make sure we feel comfortable moving forward with rating the strategies.
Do we have any examples of hummingbird supportive practices? Can we say a little more about what that means? Number 4.
Yeah, let me try and pull up one of our older lists as well. I think that's a good point. We need to make sure we're on the same page about what that means. While I'm pulling that up, are there any other questions?
I have a comment about research and monitoring. So
yeah,
I think that's something that people can rank in the context of understanding more about what do hummingbirds need, and especially in like a place like Mexico, but also throughout their range, in terms of their preferred foods. We really don't know that much about the insects that they're eating throughout their range, what their preferences are, monitoring success or failure of the things that are implemented. So even though curiosity-driven research leads to a lot of applied applications, I just wanted to note that there's a lot of questions that we still have around what is the right thing to do to recover these populations. At least I think there is.
okay, and I see Oscar says it would be helpful to separate threats and solutions by country and then come up with a general list for the 3 countries.
And
Yeah,
more what
maybe.
we're doing, just to respond to that, is that we're looking at it by life cycle. So we're looking at breeding range, non-breeding range, the overall range, and then our next discussion will be on migration.
I also wanted to ask, as a person who's facilitating the group, some of the breakout. So this is a list, but people can add other things to it, right?
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do right now, is just see if there's any gaps. And I see someone just added in social science. So personally, I guess I want to make sure we're thinking of there's strategies to, again, mitigate threats or influence the health of hummingbird species. And then there's hopefully ways to do those strategies, right? And so applying social science or very targeted social science could be a strategy, but similar to climate change, it could also be more of an approach to the strategy. So it might be something that you're not doing in isolation. It's not the strategy itself, but you're applying that social science to the strategies that are chosen. So just different ways to different perspectives. It's not that one's right or wrong. It's just making sure you're also considering that option. Sarah E.
Hola, muchas gracias. Mira, yo quiero opinar respecto a una pregunta que hizo Greg en relación a apoyar a las alianzas y cómo establecer prácticas en apoyo de los colibríes. Creo que aquí tenemos al director de la Reserva de la Biosfera Sierra de Manantlán y me gustaría que él hable de en qué sentido desde lo local hemos podido hacer estas alianzas con una experiencia muy puntual y bueno, y cómo nos conecta el Hummingbird Partnership. Fernando, ¿estás por ahí?
Aquí estamos, Araí. Muchas gracias.
Sí, gracias, Fernando. Sí, nos gustaría platicar contigo tu experiencia como director de la reserva y estas alianzas para la conservación de los hábitats de los colibríes.
Seguro que sí, Saraí, con mucho gusto. Nosotros, desde la plataforma de la Dirección de la Reserva, como un organismo de gobierno, hemos logrado crear diferentes alianzas en el territorio, principalmente con los dueños y poseedores. Ahorita tenemos una red de 50 monitores comunitarios, que es gente de los ejidos y de las comunidades, que nos ayudan a temas de educación ambiental, pero también al monitoreo de las especies. Y dentro de esta red de vigilantes comunitarios, por supuesto que se inserta la Universidad de Guadalajara a través de toda la generación de conocimiento y del manejo, la protección y la restauración de los ecosistemas que ya llevamos a cabo de manera conjunta entre lo que es la universidad, la red de vigilantes comunitarios, los brigadistas forestales y la dirección del área natural protegida. Sin embargo, adicionalmente, en los últimos años se suman también las juntas intermunicipales, que son unos organismos públicos descentralizados del gobierno de Jalisco, en donde también ellos han participado en las actividades de restauración de los ecosistemas para crear hábitat de los colibríes. Entonces, hemos hecho una estrategia muy integral en donde cada quien desde sus funciones y su espacio de trabajo, hemos logrado avanzar en la conservación y en la protección de los colibríes. A través de la universidad, a través del monitoreo y la generación de la información, nosotros como un ente público federal, implementando políticas públicas que van orientadas a la conservación de los colibríes y de algunas otras aves, protegiendo y restaurando el hábitat y las especies que son importantes para los colibríes y están asociadas a ellos, y con la participación de las comunidades y de los ejidos, que finalmente ellos son los dueños del territorio. Entonces nos ayudan a regular actividades productivas, pero también fortalecen las actividades de protección y conservación ambiental. Y ellos sirven como promotores en sus comunidades a través de la promoción de mejores prácticas de agricultura y de ganadería en los territorios de los que son dueños, Y con esto vamos formando toda una estrategia muy integral para la conservación orientada principalmente hacia los colibríes migratorios, ¿no? Entonces, así es como tenemos a la sociedad civil en general, gobierno del estado, gobierno federal, pero también tenemos a la academia incidiendo, todos trabajando en una sola estrategia que hemos ido elaborando de manera conjunta. No ha sido sencillo, pero la verdad es que ha sido bastante interesante, ¿no? Entonces, otro comentario que quisiera hacer, que habla aquí de mejores prácticas de agricultura, yo creo que tenemos que meter también ahí mejores prácticas de ganadería a través de sistemas silvopastoriles, en donde podemos meter también algunas especies que sean de importancia para los colibríes, y no solamente meternos en temas de agricultura, sino también de ganadería sustentable. Y con esto, pues también estamos integrando otro elemento que ya salió en la dinámica pasada, que se había identificado como una de las amenazas más fuertes, ¿no? Entonces, es así como hemos ido trabajando en los últimos años en Manantlán, y espero que esta experiencia les pueda servir a todos.
Muchas gracias, Fernando. Muy atinada la respuesta y bueno, creo que se tiene que trabajar a todos los niveles, ¿verdad? Desde la parte muy local a esta parte que es la internacional. Muchísimas gracias.
Perdón, esta parte internacional, Saray, que no mencioné, claro que es fundamental, ¿no? Digo, nosotros hemos estado trabajando con todo el apoyo de Susan, de Greg y de muchos otros actores que, bueno, han venido a fortalecer todo el trabajo que nosotros hemos estado desarrollando, ¿no? Entonces, también esta colaboración internacional que hemos ido desarrollando en Manantlán ha sido muy importante, ¿no?
Yeah, and thank you, Fernando, for all of your support for the work and, our visits there and everything that we've been trying to do collaboratively with you. So thank you so much.
A ustedes, gracias.
Great. Well, not to overload you with information, but I did want to just bring us back to some of this brainstorming, and along with what Greg was asking about. I think, Greg, you were asking about which piece here? Oh, kind of this hummingbird supportive practices. So just so you know where this brainstorm came from, it looks like it was mostly focused on investing in local nurseries for chemical safe bird friendly plants, partnering with native plant nurseries, native plant lists, nurseries, existing organizations that provide lists of native plants. So we can kind of rewrite that strategy if that's not clear to people, but the hummingbird supportive practices looks like it was mostly focused on, again, nurseries and pollinator conservation initiatives, native plant nurseries.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I heard some discussion in here about, I heard livestock best practices, and then I've seen in here, different pieces that have come up a few times now about enforcement. Does anyone have a proposal for, again, should I add those as separate strategies versus do you think that they're captured with what we have here? Livestock best practices, is that separate enough in people's minds to separate it from the agricultural practices?
Sometimes, Jacqueline, and you can, give your recommendation here. Sometimes it helps to separate them just for clarity's sake.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that would be possible, just to make sure we're clear about what people mean and what exactly they want to address. And then if we merge it back in, we can lump it back together if it, doesn't come up as highly ranked.
I think that's helpful. And I think some of that is cultural in itself, whereas some communities lump that all together. So right now, let's think of the agricultural practices very much kind of the growing, and we'll think of the livestock practices kind of as the animals. Okay, and then what about the enforcement piece? Is there a strategy that should be more heavily focused on enforcement, and that being different from just sustainable practices or policies, but actually increasing enforcement?
If I could comment on that here, I think framing it as enforcement is a mistake, actually. I have a couple of papers open where the recommendation, if the idea is to mitigate diversity loss driven by organized crime, particularly with narcotic trafficking, the idea or like an action that could be taken in the states to improve the outcomes in the non-breeding grounds is to decriminalize rather than enforce. That's a contentious opinion to some, but I'll share these two papers in this chat in case anyone is interested.
We also have a request to better define support, incentives, and policies.
Yeah, so I just put in the chat there the link if anyone wants to look more in depth in that slide. And then I just kind of summarized that was coming from tax breaks, increasing legislation, and maybe promoting more aligned international policies.
And I think it might be good to hear from somebody from Mexico on this one. Sorry, I don't know if you or someone else can speak to that too. To the topic.
The enforcement, is that what you're
talking about? Yeah, the enforcement. Mm-hmm.
Whether or not it should be added. And again, this is to add it as a strategy to rate. So it's not like we're adding it right now and that's what we're going to focus on.
So Saraí. Okay, Fernando. Yeah, Fernando, I'm sure he has a good insight on this.
Sí, bueno, en la dinámica anterior también comentábamos el punto de que toda esta parte del crimen organizado se debe de manejar en una escala diferente al cambio de uso de suelo, porque es diferente la actividad del crimen organizado en términos de productividad de aguacate, de agave, de todo esto que afecta a los ecosistemas y al colibrí, obviamente, a el cambio de uso de suelo o el mal manejo que hace el propietario de la tierra, que no tiene que ver con el crimen organizado, ¿no? Entonces, en los comentarios que leí, decía algo que también es, pues como consumo por parte de los Estados Unidos del aguacate o del propio tequila, que se debería de promover desde México y en Estados Unidos fortalecerlo, un tema de un sello para que se consuma aguacate, que estemos seguros que sea proveniente de actividades sustentables y que no está afectando el hábitat de las especies, ¿no? Quizá migrar a los productores a una certificación en México suele ser muy complejo y un proceso bastante largo, ¿no? Pero, por ejemplo, desde la plataforma de la reserva estamos trabajando un sello en donde dice que es 100% sustentable, pero que además viene de una fuente segura, que es de un área natural protegida, que la producción se está haciendo sin afectar ecosistemas y que no está asociado eso a, sin decirlo explícitamente, pero sí se medio menciona que no está asociado a crimen organizado la producción de agave o de tequila, mejor dicho, o del aguacate, ¿no? Entonces, quizá desde Estados Unidos apoyar en promover estas buenas prácticas de las personas que están trabajando bien, para que el consumo que se haga allá, pues se tenga certeza que es un producto que viene derivado de buenas prácticas, ¿no? Y desde aquí, desde México, pues a lo mejor fortalecer estas actividades para los productores que lo están haciendo bien y buscar estos sellos y en un mediano plazo esta parte como de certificaciones, ¿no? Esto me parece que ya se hace en otras Europa, bueno, en Europa o en otros países, en otros sitios, incluso a partes del aguacate que va de México le llaman aguacate de sangre, ¿no? Justo por la producción que no es ni sustentable y está asociado a crimen organizado. Entonces me parece que esto se puede impulsar para convertirlo en una política pública, usando como plataforma a lo mejor ciertos sitios como las áreas naturales protegidas, que ya a lo mejor vamos trabajando con estos temas, ¿no? Creo que pudiera ser una de las opciones.
Thanks for that. I'm not sure if I got I think I got a really good understanding of kind of the problems. As far as enforcement itself, I was hearing maybe that there could be other avenues such as, you know, policy, certification, other things like that. So if I'm not understanding that correctly, please someone advocate to add a different strategy in. Otherwise, I'm seeing that it could fit in some of the categories we currently have. Okay. I know that we're probably all not going to feel 100% comfortable going into maybe rating, knowing that there's so much more that can be discussed, and there will be much more discussed, but we do just want to get kind of a sense with the strategies that are here. And again, we separated out that promotion of the agricultural practices with the sustainable livestock practices. So that's one change we made. And then we will make sure maybe some of those drivers that were pulled out are represented more in our model or come through when we're developing specific activities, like the very specific activities for some of these strategies that kind of move forward. But I do want to get just an initial rating so we can start to see the significance and the impact that some of these strategies could hold. So I'm going to put this link back in the chat. Susan is going to be putting us into breakout groups again. And I know that we don't have a ton of time, but let's try and spend about 5 to 10 minutes doing your initial rating. We're going to do a 1 to 4 rating scale. 4 is very high, but you're thinking of it as having very high feasibility and impact. So 4 is kind of your best, unlike the threats, meaning like your worst threat. This is your kind of your best choice strategy. And then 1 will be low. Okay. So go through, you'll be in small groups. I'll stop sharing my screen. And then we'll come back together and have some time to discuss next steps and how we're going to integrate some of this information.
And I've reworked the rooms a little bit. So if you find yourself in a room with some different people, don't be surprised. That's where you're supposed to be. So
thanks for that reminder, Susan.
Yeah, just so they don't think they're in the wrong place. All right, here you go.
Some comments from our group were, first of all, moving forward, we have to work in an imperfect world of knowledge. So the best management or beneficial management practices don't always know what to follow through with, but based on the information we have, and then building on whatever comes out of research and monitoring. Another point was, addressing the social science, social marketing to the demand side for products that are impacting hummingbird or wildlife habitat, and specifically avocados in that case, and that maybe there's some possibilities of doing certification for hummingbird or pollinator friendly products, and the acknowledgement that that can be really expensive to get certification to the farmer, and the need to possibly link with NGOs that can help with that certification, help funding it, maybe from outside of Mexico or within Mexico. Those are some of the things that came up in terms of priorities and strategies.
Thanks. That was a great synopsis. Any other quick comments?
Yes, our group was very interested in working in urban areas, taking advantage of Mexico's Urban Bird Program. And Simon thinks he might be able to find a publication that suggests that even if there's a lot of small pollinator gardens, it can make population impacts for the target species. So that was a fun conversation.
Great. And I'll just encourage you all, we're constantly providing a lot of avenues to get us information. So at any point, please feel free to email myself or Susan, or come back to the mural link here and add resources down below. There's a lot of different ways to make sure that we're getting this information out there. I know one of the most valuable parts of having these workshops is just getting so many of you experts together. Sarah E., and then we'll pass it to Susan.
Yes. En nuestro grupo también fue una bonita discusión, principalmente los que estábamos en el grupo coincidimos en que tenemos como 4 prioridades y tiene que ver con la educación y divulgación, el que haya investigación y monitoreo, también tenerme las mejores prácticas y aplicar, porque tenemos buenas políticas públicas. La cosa es que la implementación muchas veces no es la mejor. Entonces, también uno de nuestros participantes decía que sería muy interesante escuchar cuáles son esas estrategias en zonas de conflicto y cuáles son esas estrategias para solucionar los conflictos que hay, sobre todo con estos temas de drogadicción y pues deforestación y todo lo ilegal.
Great, thanks for adding that, sorry. And I think we are hearing that, especially in this non-breeding region, over and over. So we want to make sure that kind of that thread comes through. Okay, well, I know it never feels like enough time, but since we only have about 2 minutes left, I'm going to pass it over to Susan so she can give us a very expedited summary of kind of where we're headed next. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thank you so much. And first, I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here today. Thanks for those of you who have come back and again, to our translators, to Jacqueline, Sari for serving as our Mexico host today and working with all of the partners. We really appreciate your input. We feel like this is a critical part of hummingbird conservation, and we're looking forward to moving towards putting together this plan. Next on our agenda is to host one last session, which would focus on the migration route, and if there are any particular issues related to threats to hummingbirds on migration. And so we are looking to squeeze that in before the holidays. So you'll be hearing from us early next week about hopefully a proposed date from our partners from the Western Hummingbird Partnership and from our translators also. So stay tuned for that. But again, we just want to say that we appreciate all of your support. The planning process, what we're doing is going through all of your recommendations and all of this work. It'll be, again, compiled into a conservation plan that we're looking at making a live plan. So not just a document, but something that we can use as a guidance for future conservation work. As Greg mentioned, we want to make sure that we can help to support on the ground conservation of hummingbirds and using this plan as a guiding tool. So with that, Greg, would you like to add any final words for today?
I think that's great. I think we made a lot of progress today, and I'm thinking if we do the migration session, that's a good time to think about wintering grounds in the Southwest as well. But I think we can tie those in together and think about actions in the Southwestern United States. So yeah, hope people can join us for that.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. And hope you can go stretch now.